Picture, if you will, a woman whose name has echoed through 20 centuries, a queen whose intelligence shaped empires yet whose story has been buried beneath layers of propaganda, romance, and myth. Imagine Alexandria in its golden age, when the greatest library the world had ever known stood beside marble palaces and the Pharaoh's lighthouse guided ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. Now imagine this magnificent city ruled by a woman who spoke 9 languages, commanded navies, negotiated with the most powerful men of Rome, and understood that her kingdom's survival hung by the thinnest of threads in an age when kingdoms themselves were becoming obsolete. This is the story of Cleopatra VII Philopator, the last active pharaoh of Egypt, a woman whose reign from 51 to 30 BCE marked not merely the end of a dynasty but the final chapter of 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. Before we journey back to that extraordinary time, if you enjoy these deep explorations of history's most fascinating figures and events, please consider liking this video and subscribing to The Drowsy Archivist. Your support helps us continue creating these detailed historical narratives. And if there are other historical topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes, leave your suggestions in the comments below. Now, let us travel back more than 2,000 years to a world where the Roman Republic was tearing itself apart in civil war, where the Hellenistic kingdoms that had ruled the eastern Mediterranean for 3 centuries were crumbling before Rome's inexorable advance, and where in Egypt, a young woman of 18 was about to inherit a throne that had stood since the time of Alexander the Great. We will follow Cleopatra's remarkable journey through decades of tumult and triumph, explore the political genius that lay behind the romantic legends, examine her role not just as Caesar's lover or Antony's partner but as a capable ruler fighting to preserve her kingdom's independence, and finally confront the tragic end that transformed her into both a historical figure and an eternal legend. But to understand Cleopatra, we must first understand the world that shaped her, the dynasty that produced her, and the impossible challenges that awaited her from the moment she took the throne. The dynasty into which Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, yet it was fundamentally foreign to the land it governed. When Alexander the Great died unexpectedly in Babylon in 323 BCE, his vast empire, stretching from Greece to India, immediately began to fracture as his generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, fought among themselves for control of various territories. Among these ambitious men was Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, one of Alexander's most trusted companions and bodyguards. Ptolemy had been appointed satrap or governor of Egypt after Alexander's death, and he quickly recognized that this ancient land, with its vast agricultural wealth, its strategic position, and its 3,000-year-old aura of divine kingship, could become the foundation of a powerful independent realm. For the first 18 years after Alexander's death, Ptolemy ruled Egypt nominally in the name of Alexander's half-brother Philip III and then Alexander's infant son Alexander IV, but these were merely formalities. Ptolemy was consolidating his hold on Egypt, defending it successfully against invasion attempts by rival generals, and carefully building the administrative and military structures that would support an independent kingdom. Then, on November 7, 305 BCE, Ptolemy took the momentous step of declaring himself king and pharaoh, adopting the title Ptolemei Soter, which meant Ptolemy the Savior. With this act, he founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line that would rule Egypt for 275 years, until the death of his descendant Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE. The Ptolemaic kingdom that Ptolemy I established was a remarkable hybrid of Greek and Egyptian elements. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks who brought with them the language, culture, and administrative practices of the Hellenistic world. They established their capital not in ancient Memphis or Thebes, the traditional seats of Egyptian power, but in the new city of Alexandria, which Alexander himself had founded on the Mediterranean coast in 332 BCE. Alexandria quickly became one of the great cities of the ancient world, a gleaming metropolis of marble and limestone that served as the intellectual and commercial hub of the eastern Mediterranean. Here the Ptolemies built their magnificent palace complex, which eventually occupied nearly a third of the city. Here too they established the Great Library, which would become the largest collection of scrolls and books in the ancient world, and the Museum, a temple to the Muses that functioned as a research institute attracting scholars, scientists, and poets from across the Greek world. Yet while Alexandria was thoroughly Greek in character, the Ptolemies understood that to rule Egypt effectively, they needed to connect themselves to the ancient pharaonic tradition that had governed the land for millennia. Thus they adopted Egyptian royal titles and iconography, commissioned temples in the traditional Egyptian style, participated in ancient religious ceremonies, and presented themselves to their Egyptian subjects as the legitimate successors to the pharaohs of old. On temple walls throughout Egypt, The Ptolemies are depicted in traditional pharaonic garb, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, making offerings to the ancient gods. Yet this was largely a veneer. The Ptolemies remained fundamentally Greek in culture and outlook. They spoke Greek, not Egyptian. They married according to Greek custom, eventually adopting the Egyptian pharaonic practice of brother-sister marriage, but only after several generations. They governed through a bureaucracy staffed primarily by Greeks and Macedonians, though Egyptians filled many of the lower administrative positions. The early Ptolemies, particularly Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and Ptolemy III Euergetes, were vigorous and capable rulers who expanded Egypt's power and influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean. At its height in the 3rd century BCE, the Ptolemaic Empire controlled not only Egypt but also Cyrenaica in modern Libya, Cyprus, parts of Syria and Palestine, coastal regions of Asia Minor, and various islands in the Aegean Sea. The Ptolemies fought repeated wars with the Seleucid Empire, another Hellenistic kingdom founded by Alexander the General Seleucus, for control of the Levant. They interfered in the politics of the Greek mainland and the Aegean Islands. They developed a powerful navy that made Egypt a major Mediterranean power. Economically, they transformed Egypt into a highly productive and profitable kingdom through careful management of agriculture, control of trade routes, and monopolization of key industries. But by the 2nd century BCE, the Ptolemaic kingdom had begun a long, slow decline. The dynasty became plagued by the very things that would eventually weaken and destroy it: civil wars between rival claimants to the throne, palace intrigues and assassinations, the practice of sibling marriage that produced weak or incompetent rulers, and increasingly Roman interference in Egyptian affairs. The Ptolemies had initially seen Rome as a useful counterweight to their Hellenistic rivals. But as Rome grew ever more powerful, conquering the Greek mainland, defeating the Seleucid Empire, and establishing dominance over the entire Mediterranean, Egypt found itself increasingly dependent on Roman support for its very survival. Rome's relationship with Egypt was complex and calculating. The Romans coveted Egypt's immense wealth, particularly its grain production, which could feed Rome's growing population. Yet they were also wary of allowing any single Roman general or politician to gain control of such a rich prize, which could upset the delicate balance of power within the Roman Republic. So instead of direct annexation, Rome increasingly treated Egypt as a client state, a nominally independent kingdom whose rulers held power only with Roman approval and support. Roman politicians and generals intervened repeatedly in Egyptian dynastic disputes, backing one claimant against another in exchange for money, political advantage, or simple gratitude. Some Romans even proposed that Egypt should be formally annexed as a Roman province, arguing that ancient wills had given Rome the legal right to do so, though these proposals were repeatedly defeated by those who feared the political consequences of such vast wealth falling into any individual's hands. Into this world of dynastic weakness, financial crisis, and Roman domination, Cleopatra VII was born in early 69 BCE. She was the daughter of Ptolemy XII Elites, whose very name, meaning the flute player, suggested something of his character. Ptolemy XII was not a strong or capable king. He had come to power in 80 BCE following the murder of his cousin Ptolemy XI, and his entire reign was marked by dependency on Rome and unpopularity at home. The Egyptian people resented his willingness to bow to Roman demands, while the Romans viewed him with a mixture of contempt and opportunism, happy to extract money and concessions from him while providing just enough support to keep him on his shaky throne. In 58 BCE, when Rome annexed Cyprus, which had been ruled by Ptolemy Xi's brother, and Ptolemy made no protest, popular anger in Egypt boiled over and he was driven from his throne by his own subjects. Ptolemy XII spent 3 years in exile, desperately seeking Roman help to regain his kingdom. He spent lavishly bribing Roman politicians and generals, falling deeply into debt to Roman financiers. Finally, in 55 BCE, the Roman general Aulus Gabinius invaded Egypt with a military force and restored Ptolemy XII to his throne. The restoration came at an enormous price. Ptolemy had to pay Gabinius and his forces handsomely, and he was left with staggering debts to Roman moneylenders. To pay these debts, he imposed crushing taxes on his Egyptian subjects, making himself even more unpopular. He also left a garrison of Roman soldiers in Egypt, ostensibly to protect him but effectively making Egypt even more of a Roman client state. The kingdom Ptolemy XII would pass to his children was financially exhausted, politically unstable, dangerously dependent on Rome, and deeply unpopular with its own people. Cleopatra grew up in this atmosphere of crisis and dependency, in a palace where survival depended on navigating treacherous political currents both domestic and foreign. She received an exceptional education, as befitted a Ptolemaic princess. The Ptolemies prized learning and intellectual accomplishment, and the royal children were taught by the finest scholars available. Cleopatra proved to be a brilliant student. According to the ancient writer Plutarch, who wrote about a century after her death, she was fluent in at least 9 languages, including her native Greek, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, and others. This linguistic ability was remarkable, but what made it truly extraordinary was that Cleopatra was apparently the first Ptolemaic ruler in nearly 300 years to actually learn to speak Egyptian, the language of the vast majority of her subjects. Every one of her ancestors, from Ptolemy I through Ptolemy XII, had ruled Egypt while speaking only Greek, communicating with their Egyptian subjects only through translators. Cleopatra's decision to learn Egyptian showed both her intellectual curiosity and her political intelligence. She understood that to rule Egypt effectively, she needed to connect with her Egyptian subjects in ways her ancestors never had. But language was not Cleopatra's only accomplishment. She studied mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and astronomy. Ancient sources suggest she wrote treatises on medicine, cosmetics, and other subjects, though these works have not survived. She was known for her quick wit and conversational brilliance, qualities that would serve her well in the years to come. Yet all her education and intelligence could not alter one fundamental reality. She was a woman in a world where power was held by men, a member of a declining dynasty in a kingdom being slowly absorbed into a Roman Empire that showed no mercy to those who stood in its way. In 52 BCE, when Cleopatra was about 17, her father Ptolemy XII made her his co-regent, as indicated by inscriptions at the Temple of Hathor at Dendra. This was an unusual move, suggesting that Ptolemy XII recognized something special in this daughter, some quality that made her worthy of sharing his power. But it was also a pragmatic decision. By associating Cleopatra with his rule, he was preparing the way for her eventual succession. When Ptolemy XII died in March 51 BCE, his will designated that Cleopatra, now 18 years old, and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was only about 10, should rule Egypt together as co-rulers. In keeping with Ptolemaic tradition, they were to marry, though whether they actually went through with this marriage ceremony is unclear from the historical record. On March 22, 51 BCE, Cleopatra performed her first official act as queen. She traveled to Hermontis, near Thebes in Upper Egypt, to install a new sacred Butchis bull, worshipped as an intermediary for the god Montu in the ancient Egyptian religion. This was a deeply traditional ceremony, one that connected her to the ancient pharaonic past and demonstrated to her Egyptian subjects that she understood and respected their religious traditions. It was exactly the kind of political theater at which Cleopatra would prove herself a master in the years to come. But the kingdom Cleopatra inherited in 51 BCE was in desperate condition. Egypt was nearly bankrupt, its treasury drained by her father's debts to Rome and his costly restoration to power. The Nile, source of Egypt's agricultural wealth, had experienced several years of poor flooding, leading to crop failures and famine. The people were restless, resentful of heavy taxation and foreign domination. And Rome, which had helped restore Ptolemy XII precisely to ensure Egypt remained weak independent, watched carefully to ensure that the young queen and her even younger brother did not attempt any moves toward real independence. Within Egypt itself, Cleopatra would soon face an even more immediate threat. Her brother's advisors, who had no intention of allowing an 18-year-old queen to actually wield power, were already plotting to remove her from the throne entirely. The co-rule of Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII began under ominous circumstances. Although Cleopatra was the elder sibling by roughly 8 years and clearly the more capable ruler, the Egyptian court was dominated by men who had no interest in seeing a woman hold real power. Chief among these was Pothinus, a powerful eunuch who served as Ptolemy XI's regent and administrator. Pothinus had effectively controlled the young king since childhood and had no intention of relinquishing that control. Alongside him stood Achilles, a prominent military commander who controlled Egypt's armed forces, and Theodotus of Chios, who served as Ptolemy XI's tutor and advisor. These 3 men formed a cabal determined to make Ptolemy XIII the sole ruler of Egypt, with themselves as the true power behind the throne. For the first few months of the co-regency, an uneasy balance existed. Official documents from this period show both Cleopatra's and Ptolemy XI's names, though the order in which they appeared varied. But Cleopatra was no passive figurehead content to share power with advisors she did not control. Ancient documents from August 51 BCE show that she had begun listing herself as sole ruler, with Ptolemy XI's name either absent or relegated to a secondary position. This was a bold assertion of her primacy, a declaration that she, not her brother or his advisors, would rule Egypt. It was also a direct challenge to Pothinus and his allies, one they could not allow to stand. The power struggle between Cleopatra and her brother's faction intensified throughout 51 and 50 BCE. We can only glimpse the details through fragmentary historical sources, but it is clear that Cleopatra was gradually losing ground. Pothinus and Achilles controlled the army and much of the bureaucracy. They had the advantage of tradition on their side as well. Despite 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, Egyptian society remained deeply patriarchal, and many in the kingdom were uncomfortable with the idea of a woman as primary ruler. By the autumn of 50 BCE, official documents show Ptolemy Xi's name appearing before Cleopatra's, a clear sign that the political tide had turned against her. The young queen found her authority systematically undermined, her orders countermanded, her supporters pushed aside. Then, sometime in 49 BCE, the situation reached a breaking point. The exact circumstances are lost to history, but the outcome is clear. Cleopatra was forced to flee Egypt. She had been outmaneuvered by her brother's advisors, possibly facing the threat of arrest or assassination if she remained in Alexandria. She fled to Syria, beyond the reach of Ptolemy Xi's forces, where she began the desperate work of gathering support for her return. Cleopatra was now a queen in exile, driven from her own kingdom by a 10-year-old boy and his unscrupulous advisors. It would have been easy to despair, to accept defeat, to fade into obscurity as so many failed claimants to thrones had done before her. But Cleopatra was not the despairing type. In Syria, Cleopatra set about raising an army. This was no simple task. She had no territory of her own, no treasury to draw upon, no standing military forces. She had to rely on her personal charm, her political skills, and whatever support she could muster from those who saw advantage in backing her claim to the Egyptian throne. Somehow, through means the historical record does not fully reveal, she succeeded in recruiting a mercenary force large enough to challenge her brother for control of Egypt. By 48 BCE, she had marched this army to Pelusium, Egypt's eastern frontier fortress, where she prepared to face Ptolemy Xi's forces in battle for control of the kingdom. But while Cleopatra was gathering her forces in Syria, the wider Mediterranean world was tearing itself apart in a civil war that would ultimately prove far more significant for her future than any battle she might fight against her brother. In Rome, the long-simmering tensions between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, the 2 most powerful men in the Roman Republic, had finally erupted into open warfare. This conflict was not merely a personal rivalry between 2 ambitious generals. It represented a fundamental crisis in the Roman Republic itself, a struggle over whether Rome would continue as a republic governed by the Senate and traditional institutions, or whether it would effectively become a dictatorship under a single all-powerful leader. Pompey the Great, whose full name was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, had been Rome's greatest general before Caesar's conquest of Gaul. He had defeated pirates, conquered much of the East, settled the affairs of numerous kingdoms and cities, and returned to Rome in triumph. But he had grown conservative in his old age, aligning himself with the Senate and the traditional aristocratic faction. Caesar, younger and more radical, had used his conquest of Gaul to build a massive loyal army and a political base that threatened the traditional power structure. When the Senate, backed by Pompey, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, Caesar instead crossed the Rubicon River with his legions in January 49 BCE, an act of rebellion that plunged Rome into civil war. For Egypt and for Cleopatra, this Roman civil war presented both danger and opportunity. Pompey had connections to Egypt stretching back decades. He had been a political ally of Ptolemy XII and had supported his restoration to the throne. The Ptolemaic court naturally felt some obligation to Pompey for these past favors. More pragmatically, anyone who hoped to maintain good relations with Rome needed to carefully gauge which side would ultimately win the civil war and align themselves accordingly. Choose the wrong side, and Egypt might face Roman invasion or the installation of a hostile puppet ruler. Choose correctly, and Egypt might win valuable favor with Rome's future master. The civil war moved with stunning speed. Caesar pursued Pompey across Italy, Spain, and Greece, winning victory after victory. In August 48 BCE, the 2 forces met at Pharsalus in central Greece in a massive battle that would decide the war. Despite being significantly outnumbered, Caesar's battle-hardened legions crushed Pompey's larger but less experienced army. Pompey himself barely escaped the battlefield with his life, fleeing with a small group of supporters to the coast, where he took ship and sailed eastward. But where could Pompey go? Caesar controlled Italy and the western provinces. The east, which Pompey had once dominated, was now uncertain territory. In his desperation, Pompey decided to sail to Egypt, hoping to find sanctuary with the kingdom whose previous king he had helped restore to power. The decision was made. When Pompey rowed ashore in a small boat, accompanied by only a few attendants, he was met not by a welcoming committee but by assassins. As he stepped onto Egyptian soil, he was stabbed to death, murdered on the orders of the young king whose father he had befriended. His head was cut off to be presented as proof of his death, and his body was left on the beach. It was a sordid, dishonorable end for a man who had once been the most powerful figure in Rome. It was also a catastrophic political miscalculation by Ptolemy XII's advisors. They had reasoned that killing Pompey would curry favor with Caesar, but they completely misunderstood the nature of Roman aristocratic culture and Caesar's own character. Just days after Pompey's murder, Caesar himself arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his defeated rival with a small force of about 4,000 soldiers. When Pothinus presented Caesar with Pompey's severed head and ring, expecting gratitude and reward, Caesar reportedly wept and turned away in disgust. Whether his tears were genuine or political theater is impossible to say, but his reaction reflected a reality that the Egyptian court had failed to grasp. Pompey had been Caesar's son-in-law, his former political ally, and his rival in the kind of aristocratic competition that had rules and boundaries. Caesar might defeat Pompey, might even have had him killed in the heat of battle, but the cold-blooded assassination of a Roman of Pompey's stature by a foreign client king was an insult to Roman dignity that could not be countenanced. Caesar ordered that Pompey's body be recovered and given an honorable cremation. But Caesar did not immediately leave Egypt, as Pothinus and his allies had hoped. Instead, he announced that he would remain in Alexandria to settle the dispute between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, claiming that as consul of Rome and executor of Ptolemy XII's will, which had named the Roman people as guardians of his children, he had both the right and the duty to mediate between the feuding siblings. This was a transparent pretext, of course. Caesar had several reasons for lingering in Egypt, none of them having much to do with justice for Cleopatra or Ptolemy XIII. He needed money to pay his troops and fund his ongoing campaigns, and Egypt was wealthy. He needed to stabilize Rome's eastern frontier, and a civil war in Egypt threatened to destabilize the entire region. And perhaps, though the ancient sources are unclear on this point, he was already intrigued by reports of the brilliant young queen who had been driven from her throne. For Cleopatra, Caesar's arrival was the opportunity she had been waiting for. She understood immediately that this Roman general, who now held the power of life and death over kingdoms, could restore her to the throne if she could win him to her side. But she faced a significant problem. Ptolemy XI's forces controlled Alexandria, and she was encamped with her army at Pelusium, on the opposite side of the Nile Delta. If she marched openly to Alexandria, she would likely be intercepted and captured or killed. She needed to get to Caesar secretly, to make her case to him personally before Pothinus and his allies could poison his mind against her. What she did next would become one of the most famous scenes in ancient history, though as with so much of Cleopatra's story, it is difficult to separate fact from legend. According to Plutarch, whose account written more than a century later has shaped all subsequent retellings, Cleopatra conceived a daring plan to reach Caesar. She boarded a small boat with only her most trusted advisor, a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, and sailed secretly to Alexandria under cover of darkness. When they reached the harbor, she could not simply walk through the city to the palace where Caesar was staying, as she would certainly be recognized and seized by Ptolemy's forces. So she had Apollodorus wrap her inside a large sack. Some sources say it was a carpet or bedroll, others a bundle of bedclothes, and carry her through the palace gates as if delivering merchandise. Once inside, in Caesar's private chambers, Apollodorus untied the sack and Cleopatra emerged. The image is irresistible. The young queen, desperate and daring, literally unrolling herself at the feet of the most powerful man in the world. It has been depicted in countless paintings, films, and historical novels. Elizabeth Taylor emerging from a rolled carpet in the 1963 film Cleopatra is perhaps the most famous modern version of this scene. But is it historically accurate? Almost certainly not in its romantic particulars. The ancient sources differ on details. Plutarch says it was a bedroll, others say it was a leather sack used for carrying valuables, and some modern historians have suggested the entire story may be a fabrication or exaggeration designed to make Cleopatra's first meeting with Caesar more dramatic than it actually was. What we can say with confidence is that Cleopatra did somehow enter Alexandria secretly and did manage to arrange a private meeting with Caesar, during which she made her case for being restored to the throne. How she accomplished this feat of infiltration we may never know with certainty. But the story of the carpet, whether literally true or not, captures something essential about Cleopatra's approach to power. She was bold, creative, willing to take enormous risks, and understood that sometimes the most outrageous gambit is the one most likely to succeed. What happened in that first meeting between Cleopatra and Caesar? Here again we must separate legend from likely reality. The romantic tradition established by Plutarch and elaborated by countless later writers tells us that Caesar was immediately captivated by Cleopatra's beauty and charm, that he fell in love with her at first sight. More likely, what transpired was a negotiation between two extremely intelligent, politically astute individuals who recognized that they could be useful to each other. Cleopatra needed Caesar's military support to regain her throne. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns and its political stability to secure his eastern frontier. They could help each other, and both were pragmatic enough to recognize this fact. But there was almost certainly more to their connection than simple political calculation. Caesar was 52 years old, a man who had spent his entire adult life in the brutal world of Roman politics and warfare. He was married to Calpurnia back in Rome, though Roman aristocrats routinely maintained mistresses and extramarital affairs. Cleopatra was 21, brilliant, educated, fluent in multiple languages, and according to Plutarch, possessed an irresistible charm that had less to do with physical beauty than with the power of her personality and intellect. Plutarch explicitly states that Cleopatra's appearance was not incomparably beautiful, but that her conversation was utterly captivating. She could discuss philosophy, mathematics, literature, and politics with equal facility. She could charm and persuade and argue with a skill that few could match. Caesar, who was himself a man of extraordinary intellect and culture, an accomplished writer and orator, would have found in Cleopatra something he rarely encountered, an intellectual equal. The ancient sources, particularly Plutarch, emphasize her conversational gifts, the pleasure Caesar took in her company, the hours they spent in discussion. This was not simply a powerful man and a desperate supplicant. This was a meeting of minds, a connection between two of the most remarkable people of their age. Whether they became lovers on that first night or shortly thereafter, we do not know, but it seems almost certain that they did become lovers, and that their affair, while certainly serving both their political interests, was also marked by genuine personal connection. Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra against Ptolemy XIII had immediate and violent consequences. When Caesar summoned both siblings to appear before him and announced that he intended to mediate their dispute in accordance with their father's will, Pothinus and his faction understood that they were losing control of the situation. Caesar was clearly favoring Cleopatra, spending long hours in private with her, listening to her arguments. If he formally restored her to power, particularly as sole ruler rather than as co-regent with Ptolemy XIII, then Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus would find themselves sidelined or worse. They could not allow this to happen. What followed was the Alexandrian War, a confused and desperate conflict that trapped Caesar in Alexandria for several months. Achillas marched an army of 20,000 men into the city, far outnumbering Caesar's 4,000 soldiers. Caesar seized the palace and the royal treasury, taking both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII into protective custody, or, depending on one's perspective, holding them as hostages. The Egyptian forces began a siege of the palace quarter, cutting Caesar off from reinforcements and supplies. Caesar's forces fought back desperately, seizing control of the harbor and burning the Egyptian fleet to prevent it from being used against him. In the chaos of this naval battle, fire spread from the ships to nearby buildings, and according to some ancient sources, the fire reached the great library of Alexandria, destroying thousands of irreplaceable scrolls. Modern historians debate the extent of the damage. Some suggest only a warehouse of books near the docks was destroyed, not the main library building. But the incident has become a symbol of cultural loss caused by military conflict. The fighting in Alexandria was brutal and chaotic. Caesar's forces, though heavily outnumbered, were battle-hardened veterans of the Gallic Wars, disciplined and utterly loyal to their commander. The Egyptian forces, by contrast, were a mix of regular soldiers, mercenaries, and hastily recruited civilians, many of whom had little combat experience. The fighting surged back and forth through the streets of the palace quarter. Caesar himself supposedly leapt into the harbor at one point to escape capture, swimming to safety while holding papers above his head to keep them dry, though this story may be another dramatic elaboration. Pothinus, attempting to coordinate with the Egyptian forces while still technically in Caesar's custody, was discovered and executed for treason. The siege might have ended in Caesar's defeat had reinforcements not arrived. In early 47 BCE, a relief force led by Mithridates of Pergamum, a Roman ally, marched into Egypt from Syria, bringing fresh troops to raise the siege. Achilles marched out of Alexandria with much of his army to intercept this relief force, but Ptolemy XIII, now effectively a puppet of Caesar after Pothinus's execution, was allowed to leave the palace and join the Egyptian army, ostensibly to negotiate a peace. Instead, the young king threw in his lot with the Egyptian forces. A final battle was fought near the Nile, in which Mithridates' relief force, joined by Caesar's troops from Alexandria, decisively defeated the Egyptian army. In the rout that followed, Ptolemy XIII fled in panic. His boat capsized while crossing the Nile, and he drowned, weighed down by his golden armor. His body was later recovered from the river, the gold armor unmistakable proof of his identity. With Ptolemy XIII dead and the Egyptian forces defeated, Cleopatra's restoration to the throne was assured. Caesar arranged for her to co-rule with her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was only about 12 years old. This was mere formality, of course. Ptolemy XIV was a child with no independent power base, and everyone understood that Cleopatra would be the true ruler of Egypt. Caesar also left 3 roaming legions in Egypt, officially to protect the young queen but effectively to ensure that Egypt remained aligned with Rome and that Cleopatra remembered who had put her on the throne. The commander of these legions was Rufio, a freedman utterly loyal to Caesar, which meant that while Egypt was not formally a Roman province, it was very much under Roman influence. But before Caesar could leave Egypt to continue his campaigns elsewhere, something else happened. Cleopatra became pregnant. Given the timing, there could be little doubt that Caesar was the father. In June or July of 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, but he would be known universally by his nickname, Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. The birth of Caesarion complicated an already complex political situation. Under Roman law, Caesar could not marry Cleopatra. Roman citizens were forbidden from marrying foreigners, and in any case, Caesar was still married to Calpurnia. Nor could he formally acknowledge Caesarion as his heir, as Roman law did not recognize children born outside legitimate marriages. But Cleopatra had no such constraints. Under Egyptian law and custom, Caesarion was the legitimate son of the queen and could be designated as her heir and eventual co-ruler. More importantly, in Egypt's religious and political understanding, the pharaoh's children inherited divine blood and the right to rule. Cleopatra made no secret of her claim that Caesarion was Caesar's son. She proclaimed it openly, associated the child with Caesar's name, and clearly intended for Caesarion eventually to succeed her as pharaoh. For Cleopatra, Caesarion represented the future she hoped to secure, a child who combined the Ptolemaic dynasty with the power of Rome's greatest man, a boy who might someday unite East and West under his rule. For Caesar, Caesarion's existence was more problematic. He never formally acknowledged the boy as his son, maintaining a public silence on the matter. But he did not deny it either, and his actions suggested a tacit acceptance of the claim. According to ancient sources, before leaving Egypt in April 47 BCE, Caesar and Cleopatra took a lengthy cruise up the Nile River, an excursion that served both diplomatic and romantic purposes. Caesar was displaying himself and Cleopatra to the Egyptian people, presenting the image of their queen allied with Rome's master. It was also, undoubtedly, a pleasure cruise, a rare period of relaxation and intimacy amid the constant warfare and politicking that dominated both their lives. The procession of boats that carried them up the Nile was reportedly magnificent, a floating palace that dazzled the Egyptian crowds who gathered on the riverbanks to watch. When Caesar finally left Egypt in April 47 BCE, he did so not to return to Rome but to continue his military campaigns. King Pharnaces II of Pontus had taken advantage of the Roman civil war to seize Roman territories in Asia Minor, and Caesar marched north to deal with this threat. He crushed Pharnaces's forces in a brief, devastating campaign, the one that produced Caesar's famous message to the Senate, Veni, Vidi, Vici, or I came, I saw, I conquered. He then had to travel to North Africa to defeat the last remnants of Pompey's forces, who had regrouped in modern Tunisia and were still fighting in Pompey's name. Only in 46 BCE, nearly 2 years after he had first arrived in Alexandria, did Caesar finally return to Rome to celebrate his victories. And when he returned to Rome, Cleopatra followed him. Cleopatra's arrival in Rome sometime in late 46 BCE was a momentous event, though one that the ancient sources describe in frustratingly incomplete terms. She came officially as a client queen, an ally of Rome paying a diplomatic visit to renew her kingdom's friendship with the Roman people. She brought with her the young Ptolemy XIV, her nominal co-ruler, and at some point during her stay, likely also brought Caesarion, though the sources are unclear about whether the infant accompanied her from the beginning or arrived later. Caesar housed her not in the city proper but in his villa across the Tiber River, in the gardens known as the Horti Caesaris, a wealthy district that was technically outside Rome's formal boundaries but close enough to make visiting easy. The arrangement was transparently a romantic one. Cleopatra was Caesar's mistress, living in his property, readily accessible to him while maintaining the fiction that she was simply a visiting foreign monarch. For Roman aristocrats, maintaining mistresses was common and socially acceptable, so long as certain proprieties were observed. But Cleopatra was no ordinary mistress. She was a queen in her own right, the ruler of one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the Mediterranean. She was also, undeniably, foreign, exotic, Egyptian, everything that represented the opposite of Roman republican virtue. And she had given Caesar a son, which his Roman wife Calpurnia had never done. Roman reactions to Cleopatra's presence were mixed. Some were fascinated by this brilliant, beautiful foreign queen. Cleopatra held court at Caesar's villa, receiving Roman aristocrats and senators, conversing with them in flawless Latin, discussing philosophy and politics and literature. She brought scholars and artists in her entourage, adding to the intellectual life of Rome. One of these scholars, Sosigenes of Alexandria, even assisted Caesar in reforming the Roman calendar, creating what would become known as the Julian calendar, which with minor modifications is still used today. The statue of Cleopatra that Caesar commissioned, showing her as the goddess Venus, mother of Aeneas, legendary founder of the Roman people, and placed in the new temple of Venus Genetrix was a bold statement of her importance to him. But many Romans were deeply uncomfortable with Cleopatra's presence. The senator and orator Cicero, who visited Cleopatra at Caesar's villa and exchanged gifts with her, wrote to his friend Atticus about his intense dislike of the Egyptian queen. "I detest the queen," he wrote using a Latin phrase, reginam odi, that made no pretense of diplomatic courtesy. He found her arrogant, her courtiers sycophantic, her entire presence offensive to Roman dignity. Cicero was an old-fashioned republican who saw Caesar's increasing power and royal pretensions as dangerous to the republic, and Cleopatra seemed to embody everything wrong with Caesar's behavior. She was a monarch, and Romans prided themselves on having rejected monarchy centuries earlier. She represented Eastern luxury and decadence, which Romans both craved and affected to despise. And her relationship with Caesar suggested that he might be moving towards some form of kingship himself, perhaps even dreaming of an Eastern-style monarchy with Cleopatra by his side. These fears were not entirely unfounded. Caesar had become dictator of Rome, holding powers far exceeding those of any ordinary magistrate. He had extended his dictatorship beyond the traditional 6-month emergency period, eventually having himself appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, in early 44 BCE. He was reforming Roman institutions, settling his veterans in colonies, building massive public works, and generally behaving more like a monarch than a republican magistrate. At the festival of the Lupercalia in February 44 BCE, Mark Antony, then serving as Caesar's right-hand man, publicly offered Caesar a royal diadem, a crown. Caesar refused it, but the very fact that the offer was made showed how far Rome had drifted from its republican traditions. Was Caesar planning to make himself king? Was he considering divorcing Calpurnia and marrying Cleopatra, despite the illegality of such a marriage under Roman law? Did he intend to make Caesarion his heir? These questions haunted Rome in early 44 BCE, fueling growing opposition to Caesar among traditional republicans. The ancient sources suggest various possibilities but provide no definitive answers. Caesar himself was notoriously secretive about his ultimate intentions, revealing his plans only when the moment came to execute them. What is clear is that many senators and aristocrats believed Caesar aspired to kingship, believed Cleopatra influenced him toward Eastern monarchical models, and believed this represented an existential threat to the Roman Republic. On March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March on the Roman calendar, this festering opposition erupted into violence. A group of senators led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, men who called themselves the Liberators and claimed to be acting to save the Republic, surrounded Caesar at a Senate meeting and stabbed him to death. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, bleeding from 23 wounds, and died in the Theater of Pompey, in the very building where years earlier his great rival had celebrated his triumphs. The conspiracy involved dozens of senators, and the assassination was carried out in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, with the assassins proudly declaring that they had freed Rome from tyranny. For Cleopatra, Caesar's assassination was catastrophic. She was in Rome when it happened, living in Caesar's villa, dependent on his protection and patronage. Now her protector was dead, murdered by his own countrymen, and Rome was in chaos. The assassins were hailed as liberators by some, denounced as murderers by others. Caesar's ally Mark Antony, who had been consul alongside Caesar, seized control of Caesar's papers and funds and positioned himself as Caesar's heir. But Caesar's actual heir, according to his will, was his grandnephew Gaius Octavius, a 19-year-old student in Greece whom Caesar had adopted and who would take the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Octavian. The struggle for succession between Antony and Octavian would plunge Rome into another round of civil wars that would last more than a decade. Cleopatra remained in Rome for about a month after Caesar's assassination, though she must have feared for her safety. She may have hoped that Caesar's will would acknowledge Caesarion in some way, perhaps naming him as a secondary heir or at least recognizing him as Caesar's son. So, she was disappointed. Caesar's will left everything to Octavian and made no mention of Caesarion at all. According to the historian Cassius Dio, Octavian refused to even acknowledge Caesarion's existence, understanding that any recognition of Caesar's son by an Egyptian queen would threaten his own claim to be Caesar's true heir. Sometime in April 44 BCE, Cleopatra left Rome and returned to Egypt. Ancient sources differ on whether she took Caesarion with her or whether he had remained in Egypt all along. She also took Ptolemy XIV, her nominal co-ruler and younger brother. But Ptolemy XIV did not live long after their return to Alexandria. He died in the summer of 44 BCE under mysterious circumstances. Ancient sources suggest he was poisoned, and the obvious suspect was Cleopatra herself. Ptolemy XIV served no purpose for her. He was a placeholder co-ruler, a boy with no independent power but whose very existence complicated her claim to sole authority. With Ptolemy XIV dead, Cleopatra was free to elevate Caesarion to the position of co-ruler. She named him Ptolemy XV Caesar and began promoting the idea that he was not merely her son but the son of the great Julius Caesar, the boy who would unite East and West. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra faced a kingdom in crisis. The years of civil war, the Alexandrian War, the costs of hosting Caesar's forces. All of this had strained Egypt's finances. The Nile flooding had continued to be unreliable, leading to poor harvests and periodic famine. Cleopatra had to work to restore stability and prosperity to her realm, to repair the damage done by years of conflict, and to navigate the extremely dangerous situation developing in Rome. The Roman civil wars were resuming. The liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, had fled to the eastern provinces and were raising armies to fight against Caesar's supporters. Mark Antony and Octavian, despite their rivalry, had formed an alliance with a third man, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, creating what became known as the Second Triumvirate. This was an official division of the Roman world among the three men, with legal authority granted by the Roman people, and its stated purpose was to avenge Caesar's death and restore order to the Republic. But for Cleopatra, the Second Triumvirate meant new dangers. Both Brutus and Cassius sent messengers to Egypt requesting military and financial support for their forces. The triumvirs, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, also expected Egypt's support in their war against the liberators. Cleopatra had to navigate between these competing demands while protecting Egypt's interests. She sent some aid to the triumvirs, recognizing that they were fighting in Caesar's name and that opposing them might provoke Roman retaliation. But she was careful not to commit too heavily to either side, maintaining as much neutrality as a client kingdom of Rome could manage. The decisive battle between the triumvirs and the liberators came in October 42 BCE at Philippi in Macedonia. There, Antony and Octavian's forces crushed the Republican army. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide after the defeat, and the triumvirs emerged triumphant. In the division of power that followed, Antony took control of Rome's eastern provinces, Octavian took the west, and Lepidus received Africa. For Egypt and Cleopatra, this meant that their future relationship with Rome would depend largely on Mark Antony, the man who now controlled the East and who would, within a few years, summon Cleopatra to meet him and begin the partnership that would ultimately destroy them both. But before that meeting, Cleopatra had to focus on ruling Egypt. She worked to stabilize the kingdom's finances, reducing some taxes to win popular support while extracting revenue more efficiently from other sources. She maintained the loyalty of Egypt's priesthoods through generous support of traditional religious institutions and her personal participation in ancient ceremonies. She positioned herself as the new Isis, the goddess who embodied both Egyptian tradition and Hellenistic divinity. She cultivated relationships with neighboring kingdoms and client states, building a network of alliances that might support Egypt if Roman protection ever wavered. And she raised Caesar, promoting him as the son of Caesar, the heir to his father's greatness, the future hope of Egypt, and perhaps something more. The years between Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE and Cleopatra's meeting with Antony in 41 BCE were relatively quiet ones for Egypt, a period of recovery and rebuilding after years of crisis. But Cleopatra must have known that this quiet could not last. Rome was still riven by internal conflicts. The partnership between Antony and Octavian was an unstable one, bound together only by their common interest in defeating their enemies. Sooner or later, they would turn on each other, and when they did, Egypt and its queen would inevitably be drawn into their conflict. The question was not whether Cleopatra would face another crisis, but when it would come and how she would navigate it. The answer began to emerge in 41 BCE, when Mark Antony, having settled affairs in Greece and Asia Minor, sent a messenger to summon the queen of Egypt to meet him in the city of Tarsus in Cilicia. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony to English speakers, was in many ways the opposite of Julius Caesar, despite being Caesar's closest ally and lieutenant. Where Caesar was calculating, methodical, and intellectual, Antony was impulsive, passionate, and physical. Where Caesar maintained the cool detachment of a man who viewed the world as a game to be played and won, Antony threw himself into life with an almost desperate intensity, embracing both pleasure and combat with equal fervor. Born around 83 BCE to a distinguished but financially troubled patrician family, Antony had risen to prominence through his military skill and his fierce personal loyalty to Caesar. He had commanded Caesar's cavalry in Gaul, served as his most trusted lieutenant during the Civil War, and stood by him as consul when others wavered. He was a brilliant general, popular with soldiers who loved his rough humor and willingness to share their hardships. He was also notorious for his extravagance, his drinking, his love affairs, and his tendency to make grandiose gestures without fully thinking through their consequences. After the victory at Philippi in 42 BCE and the subsequent division of the Roman world, Antony had established himself in the East, the wealthiest and most cultured portion of Rome's domains. He needed to raise money to pay his armies and reward his supporters. He needed to stabilize the eastern provinces, many of which had been disrupted by the recent wars. And he needed to prepare for an eventual campaign against the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival in the East, which had inflicted a humiliating defeat on Roman forces just a few years earlier. To accomplish all this, Antony required the cooperation and support of the various client kings and queens who ruled the eastern territories nominally under Roman protection. Egypt was the wealthiest of these client kingdoms, and Antony had questions about Cleopatra's conduct during the recent civil wars. There had been rumors, possibly started by Cleopatra's enemies, possibly having some basis in fact, that the Egyptian governor of Cyprus had provided ships to support Brutus and Cassius. Whether Cleopatra had authorized this support or whether the governor had acted independently was unclear, but Antony wanted answers. More importantly, he wanted Egypt's financial support for his planned campaigns. So in 41 BCE, he sent his friend and diplomat Quintus Dellius to Egypt with a summons. Cleopatra was to come to Tarsus, the major city in Cilicia on the southern coast of modern Turkey, to meet with Antony and answer these questions. Cleopatra's response to this summons reveals much about her political intelligence and theatrical flair. She could have refused, claiming that as a sovereign queen she was not obligated to answer a Roman general's summons, but this would have been both dangerous and foolish. She could have gone immediately, showing proper deference to Rome's representative in the East, but this would have made her seem weak and subservient. Instead, she made Antony wait. She delayed for months, making it clear that a queen does not come running when called. Then, when she finally did come to Tarsus in the late summer or early autumn of 41 BCE, she arrived in a manner calculated to overwhelm Antony's senses and capture his imagination. The ancient descriptions of Cleopatra's arrival in Tarsus, particularly Plutarch's detailed account, read almost like myth or romance, yet they were recorded close enough to the events that they likely contained considerable truth. Cleopatra sailed up the river Cydnus to Tarsus in a magnificent barge, its stern sheathed in gold, its sails dyed the royal purple that was among the most expensive and prestigious colors in the ancient world. Silver oars flashed in the sunlight as they dipped into the water in time to the music of flutes and harps. The deck was decorated like a floating garden, with awnings of gold cloth and attendants dressed as characters from mythology. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy in the pose of Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, or Venus, her Roman equivalent. Beautiful young boys dressed as cupids fanned her, while her handmaidens, dressed as sea nymphs and graces, operated the rigging and steered the vessel. The symbolism was elaborate and multi-layered. By presenting herself as Aphrodite/Venus, Cleopatra was claiming divine status, positioning herself not merely as a mortal queen but as the earthly embodiment of the goddess. She was also implicitly commenting on Antony himself, who had recently begun promoting himself as the new Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and divine madness. In Greek and Roman mythology, Aphrodite and Dionysus were lovers. By arriving as Aphrodite to meet Antony's Dionysus, Cleopatra was suggesting a partnership, an alliance of divine figures for the good of the Eastern world. It was political theater of the highest order, carefully choreographed to appeal to Antony's well-known love of spectacle, his identification with Dionysus, and his romantic temperament. The population of Tarsus lined the riverbanks to watch this extraordinary procession, and word quickly spread through the city that Aphrodite had come to revel with Dionysus for the good of Asia. Antony, who had been holding court in the city's marketplace, reportedly found himself presiding over an empty forum as everyone rushed to the river to see the Egyptian queen. He sent messengers inviting her to dine with him, but Cleopatra, maintaining the upper hand, sent back a counter-invitation. Would he not prefer to dine with her aboard her barge? Antony, intrigued and impressed, accepted. What followed was a series of elaborate banquets and entertainments that became legendary in the ancient world. Cleopatra demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of Egypt, displaying gold and jeweled tableware, hosting feasts of exquisite foods and wines, creating an atmosphere of luxury that even the jaded Antony found impressive. One famous story, preserved by Pliny the Elder, describes a wager between Cleopatra and Antony over who could host the most expensive banquet. Cleopatra claimed she could spend 10 million sesterces, an enormous sum, on a single meal. During the dinner, after the main course had been served, she called for a cup of vinegar. She then removed one of her famous pearl earrings, dissolved it in the vinegar, and drank it, claiming to have just consumed 5 million sesterces and offering to dissolve the second earring as well. Whether this story is literally true or apocryphal, it captures something essential about Cleopatra's approach to power. She understood that sometimes the most outrageous display is the most effective. But Cleopatra's conquest of Antony was not simply a matter of wealth and spectacle. As with Caesar, Cleopatra's real power lay in her intellect and personality. Plutarch emphasizes that her conversation was irresistible, that she could discuss any topic with insight and wit, that she had the rare ability to make each person she spoke with feel that they were the most important and interesting person in the world. For Antony, whose education was respectable but who lived more in the world of action than contemplation, Cleopatra offered intellectual companionship and cultural sophistication that he found captivating. She could speak to him in fluent Greek, discussing philosophy and literature, debating points of policy and strategy. She could also match his robust sense of humor, engaging in teasing banter and wordplay. Ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra was willing to participate in Antony's rougher pleasures as well. She supposedly went fishing with him, drank with him, even dressed as a common servant and wandered the streets of Alexandria with him at night, playing pranks on the citizens. The political dimension of their partnership was equally important. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman protection to secure her throne and advance her ambitions for Caesarion. Each could provide what the other needed, and both were experienced enough in politics to recognize a mutually beneficial arrangement. At their meeting in Tarsus, they negotiated terms. Antony would provide political support and recognition for Cleopatra's rule. In return, she would provide financial and material support for his campaigns. There was also a darker side to their negotiations. Cleopatra requested that her younger half-sister Arsinoe, who had been living in exile in Ephesus under the protection of the temple there, be executed. Arsinoe represented a potential rival claim to the Egyptian throne, and Cleopatra wanted all such rivals eliminated. Antony agreed, and Arsinoe was murdered on the steps of the temple, a sacrilege that shocked many but demonstrated Antony's willingness to do whatever Cleopatra asked. From Tarsus, Antony followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria, where he spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE. This was a fateful decision. Antony's duties called him back to Rome, or at least to the western provinces, where his partnership with Octavian was already showing signs of strain. By lingering in Alexandria, he was neglecting his political base and giving his enemies ammunition to use against him. But Antony was captivated. He and Cleopatra founded a society they called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to pleasure and particularly to the cult of Dionysus. They hosted elaborate banquets, engaged in various entertainments, and lived with a lavishness that became legendary. Ancient sources describe their lifestyle with a mixture of fascination and disapproval, portraying Antony as having been utterly seduced by Eastern luxury and having forgotten his Roman duties. By 40 BCE, Cleopatra was pregnant with twins. She gave birth to a boy and a girl, whom she named Alexander Helios, the sun, and Cleopatra Selene, the moon. The names were loaded with symbolic meaning. Helios and Selene were divine powers, and by naming her children after them, Cleopatra was again asserting divine status for her family. Alexander was also the name of Alexander the Great, whose conquest had brought the Ptolemaic dynasty to Egypt in the first place. The birth of mixed-gender twins was considered particularly auspicious in ancient Near Eastern culture, echoing various divine twin pairs in Egyptian mythology. But Antony could not remain in Alexandria forever. Political necessity eventually forced him to return to the Roman world. The Parthians had invaded Syria, taking advantage of Roman distraction during the civil wars, and had to be dealt with. More immediately, Antony's wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius had raised a rebellion in Italy against Octavian, supposedly to protect Antony's interests but actually destabilizing the entire political situation. Antony needed to return west to sort out this mess. When he did, in 40 BCE, he found that Fulvia had died and that his relationship with Octavian had deteriorated to the point where war between them seemed likely. To patch up the triumvirate and avoid immediate civil war, a political settlement was arranged. Antony would marry Octavian's sister Octavia, a widow known for her virtue and dignity. This marriage was meant to cement the alliance between the two most powerful men in Rome, making them not just political partners but family. For Cleopatra, watching from Alexandria with her newborn twins, this marriage must have been a bitter development. Antony had left her to marry a Roman woman of impeccable breeding, strengthening his position in Rome at the expense of his relationship with her. Yet she was pragmatic enough to recognize that Antony's marriage to Octavia was primarily a political move, necessary to maintain his power in the Roman world. And she may have calculated that Antony would return to her eventually, drawn by the connection they had forged and the children they shared. For 3.5 years, from 40 to 37 BCE, Cleopatra and Antony had no direct contact. He remained in the Roman world, spending time with Octavia, who bore him 2 daughters. He traveled to Athens with her, presenting himself as a loving husband and loyal partner to Octavian. He prepared for his long-planned campaign against the Parthians, gathering forces and resources. Cleopatra, meanwhile, ruled Egypt, raising her 3 children, Caesarion and the twins, and positioning herself to resume her partnership with Antony when circumstances allowed. The reunion came in 37 BCE, when Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Antioch, the great city in Syria that served as the capital of Rome's eastern provinces. Their relationship resumed as if it had never been interrupted. Antony met his twins for the first time, now 3 years old, and was reportedly charmed by them. He and Cleopatra renewed their political and romantic partnership. Most significantly, Antony made an extraordinary grant of territory to Cleopatra, giving her control over vast swaths of the eastern Mediterranean. He granted her portions of Phoenicia, parts of Cilicia, Cyprus, substantial parts of Crete and Cyrenaica, and even portions of Judea, though the latter grant created immediate tensions with Herod, the Roman client king of Judea, who resented losing territory to Egypt. These grants, known as the donations of Antioch, transformed Cleopatra from a client queen ruling only Egypt into the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. The territories Antony granted her had once been part of the Ptolemaic Empire at its height in the 3rd century BCE, and by restoring them, Antony was essentially recreating that empire under Cleopatra's rule. This was an extraordinary concentration of power in the hands of a single ruler, and it demonstrated both Antony's commitment to his partnership with Cleopatra and his vision of how the East should be organized. Not as Roman provinces administered by Roman governors, but as a network of client kingdoms and territories under the ultimate authority of Rome's representative in the East, namely himself, but with day-to-day administration handled by local rulers, particularly his partner Cleopatra. From 37 BCE forward, Cleopatra and Antony's fates were inextricably linked. They would spend the next 7 years together, sometimes in Egypt, sometimes in the eastern provinces, as Antony conducted his campaigns and Cleopatra provided the financial and material support that made those campaigns possible. They would have a 3rd child together, a son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. They would face military setbacks. Antony's Parthian campaign in 36 BCE was a disaster that cost him thousands of men and political triumphs. They would watch as the relationship between Antony and Octavian deteriorated from uneasy partnership to open rivalry to inevitable war. And they would ultimately face the final confrontation that would end not only their lives but the independence of Egypt and the entire Hellenistic world. Amid the romantic drama and political intrigue that dominates most accounts of Cleopatra's life, it is easy to lose sight of a fundamental fact. Cleopatra was first and foremost a ruler. For nearly 21 years, from 51 to 30 BCE, she governed one of the most important kingdoms in the Mediterranean world. During this time, she faced challenges that would have overwhelmed lesser monarchs: civil war, foreign invasion, economic crisis, famine, and the constant threat of Roman interference. Yet she not only survived but maintained Egypt's position as a major power, preserved its independence longer than any comparable Hellenistic kingdom, and came remarkably close to achieving her ultimate goal of establishing a new Eastern empire centered on Alexandria that might rival Rome itself. To understand Cleopatra properly, we must look past the legends of seduction and romance to examine her actual accomplishments as a monarch. Cleopatra's most distinctive quality as a ruler was her linguistic ability and her willingness to engage directly with her Egyptian subjects in ways that her Ptolemaic predecessors had never done. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries before Cleopatra's birth. Yet in all that time, apparently no Ptolemaic monarch had bothered to learn the Egyptian language. They spoke Greek exclusively, communicating with their Egyptian subjects only through interpreters and intermediaries. This linguistic barrier reinforced the fundamental separation between the Greek ruling elite and the native Egyptian population. The Ptolemies were foreign conquerors who happened to have ruled for a very long time, but they never truly integrated with the culture they governed. Cleopatra broke decisively with this tradition. She learned to speak Egyptian fluently, and according to Plutarch, she was the first of her line to do so. This was not merely a linguistic accomplishment but a profound political statement. By learning Egyptian, Cleopatra could communicate directly with her subjects, participate meaningfully in Egyptian religious ceremonies, and demonstrate a respect for Egyptian culture that none of her predecessors had shown. This ability won her genuine popularity among the Egyptian population, who saw in her something they had never seen before: a Ptolemaic ruler who actually cared about Egypt and its people, not merely about extracting wealth from the land. But Cleopatra did not stop with Egyptian. Plutarch claims she spoke at least 9 languages altogether, including Greek, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, and the languages of several other neighboring peoples. This multilingual ability made her an extraordinarily effective diplomat, able to negotiate directly with foreign rulers and envoys without the limitations imposed by interpreters. It also reflected the breadth of her education and the keenness of her mind. In an age when most rulers, even educated ones, spoke only their native language and perhaps 1 or 2 others, Cleopatra's command of 9 languages set her apart as a scholar queen, someone whose intellectual accomplishments matched her political power. Cleopatra's religious role was equally important to her authority. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a political ruler but a religious figure, the intermediary between the gods and humanity, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the universe functioning properly. The Ptolemies had adopted pharaonic titles and participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, but they had done so somewhat perfunctorily, as a necessary concession to Egyptian traditions. Cleopatra, by contrast, threw herself into her religious role with apparent genuine devotion. She presented herself as the new Isis, the earthly embodiment of the goddess who was both wife and sister to Osiris, the god of the dead and resurrection, and mother to Horus, the god of kingship. The identification with Isis was particularly potent. Isis was one of the most popular deities in the ancient Mediterranean world, worshipped not only in Egypt but throughout the Hellenistic kingdoms and even in Rome itself. She represented fertility, magic, protection, and wisdom. By positioning herself as the new Isis, Cleopatra was claiming not just political authority but divine status. She wore the traditional royal regalia, including the uraeus, the sacred cobra, on her crown. She participated in ancient ceremonies at temples throughout Egypt, traveling to sacred sites to perform the rituals that only the pharaoh could perform. She commissioned temple construction and renovation, funding elaborate building projects that employed thousands of workers and demonstrated her piety to the gods. One of the most famous depictions of Cleopatra comes from the Temple of Hathor at Dendra, where she is shown on the temple wall alongside Caesarion, both dressed in traditional pharaonic style, making offerings to the gods. The image shows no trace of Greek or Roman influence. This is pure Egyptian religious art, depicting Cleopatra as a traditional pharaoh in the style that had been used for 3,000 years. The inscription identifies her as Cleopatra, the female Horus, ruler of rulers, while Caesarion is labeled Pharaoh Caesar. This pairing of mother and son, both claiming divine authority, both presented in traditional Egyptian iconography, demonstrates how completely Cleopatra had embraced her role as an Egyptian monarch, not merely a Greek ruler who happened to control Egypt. Cleopatra's economic policies showed similar intelligence and pragmatism. When she came to power in 51 BC, Egypt was facing a severe financial crisis. Her father Ptolemy XII had left enormous debts to Roman creditors. The kingdom's finances had been strained by years of civil strife and mismanagement. Agricultural production was suffering from unreliable Nile floods, which meant lower tax revenues precisely when the state needed money most desperately. Cleopatra had to navigate between the need to extract revenue to pay debts and fund the state, and the need to avoid overtaxing her subjects to the point where they revolted. Her approach seems to have combined careful financial management with strategic tax relief. She maintained the centralized bureaucratic system that the Ptolemies had developed, which gave the state control over much of Egypt's economic life. Key industries like papyrus production, oil pressing, and brewing were state monopolies that generated reliable revenue. Agricultural production was carefully tracked and taxed, with sophisticated record-keeping that allowed the state to know exactly what each region produced and what taxes it owed. But Cleopatra also understood the value of occasionally reducing the tax burden to win popular support. Ancient sources mention that she reduced certain taxes to gain favor with the people, though the details are frustratingly vague. What is clear is that despite Egypt's financial difficulties, Cleopatra managed to maintain a functioning state, fund her military forces, and still provide the kind of financial support to first Caesar and then Antony that made her indispensable to their campaigns. One of Cleopatra's most important economic reforms was her management of the currency. The Ptolemaic kingdom had its own monetary system, separate from Rome's, and Cleopatra was one of the few Ptolemaic rulers to issue coins bearing her own image. This was a significant departure from earlier practice, where coins typically bore the images of male rulers or gods. By placing her own portrait on Egyptian coins, Cleopatra was asserting her authority in a very visible way. Every person who used these coins was reminded that Egypt was ruled by a woman, and a powerful one at that. Interestingly, the portraits of Cleopatra on these coins show a woman with strong, almost masculine features, a prominent nose, firm chin, and stern expression. These are not idealized images of beauty but presentations of authority and power, suggesting that Cleopatra was more concerned with projecting strength than with conforming to conventional standards of feminine beauty. Cleopatra's naval power was another crucial element of her rule. Egypt had always been a naval power, given its long Mediterranean coastline and the importance of controlling sea trade routes. Cleopatra maintained and expanded the Egyptian fleet, which played crucial roles in several of the conflicts she was involved in. When Caesar was besieged in Alexandria during the Alexandrian War, control of the harbor and the naval battle fought there were decisive moments in the conflict. When Cleopatra allied with Antony, her ships formed a significant portion of their combined naval forces. At the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra commanded 60 Egyptian warships, a substantial contribution to the larger fleet. The fact that she personally commanded her naval squadron, rather than simply providing ships for Antony to command, demonstrates her military authority and her willingness to participate directly in military operations. Cleopatra's diplomatic skills were perhaps her most impressive quality as a ruler. She operated in an extraordinarily difficult environment, where the survival of her kingdom depended on maintaining good relations with Rome while somehow preserving enough independence to make that survival meaningful. The fate of other Hellenistic kingdoms provided grim lessons in what happened when client states lost Roman favor or made the wrong political bet. The Seleucid Empire had been dismantled piecemeal by Rome. The kingdom of Pergamon had been bequeathed to Rome by its last king and turned into a province. The kingdom of Pontus had been conquered and its king, Mithridates VI, driven to suicide after a long war with Rome. Only Egypt, of all the great Hellenistic kingdoms, remained independent, and that independence was sustained largely through Cleopatra's brilliant management of her relationships with Roman power brokers. Cleopatra understood that Rome was not a unified entity but a collection of competing factions and ambitious individuals. The key to Egyptian survival was to align with the right Roman patron at the right time, to provide enough support to be valuable but not so much that Egypt became exhausted or vulnerable. Her relationship with Caesar had served this purpose perfectly. She provided him with money, ships, and legitimacy in the East, and in return he protected her throne and left her to rule Egypt without direct Roman interference. Her relationship with Antony followed the same pattern, but on an even larger scale. She provided the financial and material resources that made his eastern campaigns possible, and he not only protected her throne but actually expanded her territory, recreating something approaching the old Ptolemaic Empire at its greatest extent. But Cleopatra's vision extended beyond mere survival. She dreamed of creating a new political order in the eastern Mediterranean, one centered not on Rome but on Alexandria. In this vision, Egypt would not be a client kingdom of Rome but the heart of an Eastern empire that might rival Rome itself. Caesarion would be acknowledged as Caesar's true heir, uniting the legitimacy of both Rome and Egypt in one person. The eastern provinces, rather than being ruled directly by Roman governors, would be organized as a network of client kingdoms under Cleopatra and Antony's ultimate authority. The ancient glories of the Hellenistic world, the sophisticated culture and vast wealth of the East, would not be subsumed into Roman domination but would maintain their own identity and power. This vision became explicit in 34 BCE at a ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. After Antony returned from a campaign in Armenia, he staged a massive triumph in Alexandria, a Roman-style victory celebration, but held in Egypt rather than Rome, which was itself a significant political statement. At the culmination of this triumph, Antony and Cleopatra appeared before the assembled crowd on golden thrones, with their children seated on smaller thrones beside them. Antony then proclaimed a new organization of the eastern territories. Cleopatra was named Queen of Kings, and Caesarion was proclaimed King of Kings and was to be her co-ruler. Alexander Helios was granted Armenia, Media, and Parthia, territories that had not yet been fully conquered. Cleopatra Selene was granted Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus was granted Syria and Cilicia. These grants were partly theatrical. The territories had not all been conquered, and the titles were as much aspirational as real, but they represented a bold vision of the future. In this arrangement, the eastern Mediterranean would be ruled by Cleopatra and her children, with Antony as the Roman representative but with real power concentrated in the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was a direct challenge to the Roman model of provincial governance, and it was also a direct challenge to Octavian, who saw himself as Caesar's true heir and who certainly did not recognize any claim by Caesarion to that title. As a ruler, Cleopatra combined administrative competence with religious authority, military power with diplomatic skill, and short-term political maneuvering with long-term strategic vision. She was not, as Roman propaganda portrayed her, a decadent Eastern seductress corrupting strong Roman men through her wiles. She was a capable monarch who understood power and wielded it effectively. Her relationship with Caesar and Antony were not merely romances but political alliances carefully calculated to serve her interests and her kingdom's survival. She spoke her subjects' language, honored their gods, managed the economy, commanded fleets, negotiated with foreign powers, and dreamed of empires. She was, in short, a pharaoh in the fullest sense of that ancient title, the last great monarch of a 3,000-year-old tradition of Egyptian kingship. The partnership between Cleopatra and Mark Antony that began in Tarsus in 41 BCE and resumed in Antioch in 37 BCE was more than a love affair, more than a political alliance, more even than a military partnership. It was an attempt to create a new political order in the Mediterranean world, one that would challenge Rome's growing dominance and preserve some measure of independence and power for the Hellenistic East. For 14 years, from their first meeting until their deaths, Cleopatra and Antony worked together toward this goal. And for much of that time, it seemed as though they might actually succeed. Their failure, when it came, would reshape the ancient world and mark the definitive end of the Hellenistic age that had begun with Alexander the Great more than 3 centuries earlier. The foundation of their partnership was complementary need. Antony controlled the Roman East, the vast territory stretching from Greece through Asia Minor, Syria, and beyond to the borders of the Parthian Empire. But control meant little without the resources to exercise it. He needed money to pay his legions, ships to move his forces, grain to feed his armies, and diplomatic leverage with the various client kingdoms that dotted the eastern Mediterranean. He also needed a partner who understood the East, who spoke its languages, who could navigate its complex cultural and religious landscape. Cleopatra provided all of this. Egypt was the wealthiest kingdom in the region, its agricultural surplus capable of feeding vast armies, its treasury deep enough to finance extensive military campaigns. Cleopatra herself was the most sophisticated and capable monarch in the East, fluent in multiple languages, versed in both Greek and Egyptian culture, connected through family and diplomatic ties to numerous other ruling houses. For Cleopatra, Antony offered something equally valuable: military power and political protection on a scale that made it possible to dream of recreating the Ptolemaic Empire at its greatest extent. Antony commanded dozens of Roman legions, the most formidable military force the world had ever seen. With Antony's support, Cleopatra did not merely preserve Egypt's independence but actually expanded her kingdom's territory and influence. The grants Antony made to her in 37 BCE at Antioch transformed her from a client queen ruling only Egypt into a major power controlling territories from modern Libya through Egypt, Cyprus, parts of Crete, coastal regions of modern Lebanon and Israel, and portions of southern Turkey. These were not merely ceremonial grants but real administrative control, allowing Cleopatra to collect taxes, station garrisons, and exercise governmental authority over vast regions that had not been under Egyptian control for more than a century. The personal dimension of their relationship was equally important. Both ancient and modern sources debate whether Cleopatra and Antony were truly in love or whether their relationship was purely political calculation disguised as romance. The truth, almost certainly, is that it was both. They were two of the most remarkable people of their age, and they seemed to have genuinely enjoyed each other's company, to have found in each other an intellectual and emotional connection that transcended mere political convenience. The ancient sources are full of stories about their life together. Their elaborate banquets, their games and contests, their society of inimitable livers dedicated to pleasure and Dionysian revelry, their willingness to engage in pranks and adventures together, dressing as commoners and wandering the streets of Alexandria at night. One particularly charming story, preserved by Plutarch, describes a fishing contest between Cleopatra and Antony. Antony, frustrated that he was catching no fish, secretly ordered his servants to dive down and attach already caught fish to his hook, so that he could impress Cleopatra with his skill. Cleopatra discovered the deception and the next day arranged for her own servants to attach a salted, dried fish to Antony's line. When he proudly pulled it up in front of their assembled friends, everyone burst out laughing and Cleopatra teased him. "Leave the fishing rod, General, to us poor sovereigns of Pharos and Canopus. Your game is cities, provinces, and kingdoms." The story reveals a relationship of genuine warmth and humor, two people comfortable enough with each other to tease and play tricks. But beneath the pleasure and companionship lay serious political work. Cleopatra and Antony were building an empire, or at least attempting to. Between 37 and 31 BCE, they spent much of their time together, sometimes in Alexandria, sometimes in Antioch or other cities in the eastern provinces, coordinating their political and military activities. Antony conducted multiple military campaigns during these years with mixed results. His major Parthian campaign in 36 BCE was a disaster, costing him thousands of soldiers and damaging his military reputation. But his Armenian campaign in 34 BCE was more successful, resulting in the capture of the Armenian king and the annexation of Armenian territory. Throughout these campaigns, Cleopatra provided financial support, ships, supplies, and diplomatic backing. The three children Cleopatra and Antony had together, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born in 40 BC, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, born around 36 BC, were not merely the products of their romance but were central to their political vision. These children represented the future dynasty that would rule the Eastern Empire Cleopatra and Antony hoped to create. The names chosen for them reflected this vision. Alexander Helios, Alexander the Sun, evoked both Alexander the Great and the divine power of the sun god, while Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra the Moon, paired feminine divine power with the Ptolemaic royal name. Ptolemy's Philadelphus, Ptolemy the brother-loving, recalled Ptolemy II, the Ptolemaic king under whom the empire had reached its greatest extent. These were not casual names but carefully chosen symbols of imperial ambition. The donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, mentioned earlier, made this ambition explicit and public. The ceremony was extraordinary in its scope and audacity. Antony staged a Roman triumph in Alexandria, an honor that by Roman tradition should only be celebrated in Rome itself, to commemorate his Armenian victory. The captured Armenian king, Artavas II, was paraded through the streets in golden chains. Then, in the gymnasium of Alexandria before a vast crowd, Antony and Cleopatra appeared on golden thrones, with their children seated nearby. Antony declared that Caesar was the true son of Julius Caesar and therefore the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy. He proclaimed Cleopatra as Queen of Kings, the supreme monarch of the Eastern territories. He then announced the division of these territories among Cleopatra's children. Alexander Helios would rule Armenia, Media, and Parthia. Cleopatra Selene would rule Cyrenaica and Libya, Ptolemy Philadelphus would rule Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. This ceremony was revolutionary in multiple ways. First, it explicitly challenged Octavian to claim to be Caesar's heir by asserting that Caesaran, as Caesar's biological son, had a superior claim. Second, it organized the East not as Roman provinces under Roman governors but as kingdoms under members of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Third, it positioned Cleopatra, not Antony, as the supreme authority, with Antony effectively serving as the military arm of her imperial vision. Finally, it treated Roman conquests in the East as belonging not to Rome but to Cleopatra and her children, to be disposed of as they saw fit. Every one of these elements was a direct affront to Roman republican traditions and to Octavian personally. But Cleopatra and Antony were not merely dreaming of empire. They were actively working to build the political, economic, and military infrastructure that might make their vision sustainable. They minted coins showing both their faces, asserting their partnership and joint authority. They established Caesarion as Cleopatra's co-ruler in Egypt, with the title Ptolemy XV Caesar, and began promoting him as a ruler in his own right, old enough to share authority despite his youth. They cultivated relationships with client kings and cities throughout the East, building a network of alliances that might support their cause. They built up their military forces, maintaining a large navy and recruiting legions that were personally loyal to Antony rather than to the Roman state. The challenge they faced was that this entire vision depended on maintaining Antony's position in the Roman political system. Antony was one of the three members of the Second Triumvirate, the legal arrangement that gave him authority over the eastern provinces. But the triumvirate was always an unstable arrangement, a temporary expedient to end civil war and divide power among the victors. By 33 BCE, the triumvirate's legal mandate was expiring, and Lepidus, the third triumvir, had already been sidelined by Octavian. The inevitable showdown between Antony and Octavian was approaching, and both men knew it. Their rivalry was fueled by genuine political and personal animosity. Octavian was Caesar's adopted son and legal heir, cold, calculating, and utterly devoted to concentrating power in his own hands. He had spent the years since 37 BCE consolidating his control over the western provinces, eliminating rivals, building political support, and positioning himself as the defender of traditional Roman values against the corruption and decadence of the East. Antony, in Octavian's propaganda, had gone native, had been seduced by an Eastern queen, had forgotten his Roman identity and duty. He was living in luxury in Alexandria while real Romans suffered. He had celebrated a triumph in a foreign city rather than Rome. He had declared a foreign woman's bastard son to be Caesar's true heir. He had given away Roman territories to foreign monarchs. He was, in short, a traitor to Rome, corrupted by Cleopatra's charms into betraying his homeland. Antony, for his part, saw Octavian as a usurper, a young upstart who had inherited Caesar's name but not his genius, who had won power through treachery and propaganda rather than military achievement. Antony was the real soldier, the real general, the man who had stood by Caesar through the Gallic Wars and the Civil War. Octavian was a sickly politician who had never won a major battle on his own, who owed his victories to generals like Agrippa, and who now presumed to lecture Antony on Roman virtue while scheming to seize sole power. The personal hatred between them was matched by political incompatibility. Rome was no longer large enough for both of them. Cleopatra understood that the confrontation with Octavian was inevitable and that she and Antony would stand or fall together. Her fate was now inextricably linked to Antony's. If Antony defeated Octavian, then the vision of an Eastern empire centered on Alexandria might become reality, with Caesarion recognized as Caesar's heir and the Hellenistic East preserved as a viable political entity. If Octavian defeated Antony, then Cleopatra and her children faced ruin, and Egypt would almost certainly be absorbed into the Roman Empire. There was no middle ground, no possibility of neutrality or compromise. The final war was coming, and it would decide not just the fate of individuals but the future organization of the entire Mediterranean world. The slide toward open war between Octavian and Antony was gradual but inexorable, marked by increasingly bitter propaganda exchanges, diplomatic maneuvering, and the steady breakdown of what little cooperation remained between them. By 32 BCE, both men were preparing for the inevitable confrontation, gathering forces, securing alliances, and positioning themselves for the struggle that would determine who would rule the Roman world. In Rome, the political atmosphere had grown poisonous, with Octavian steadily building his case that Antony had betrayed Roman interests and become the puppet of a foreign queen. Octavian's propaganda campaign against Antony and Cleopatra was brilliantly ruthless. He could not simply declare war on Antony, who was after all a Roman citizen and had many supporters in Rome. Instead, he needed to make Antony seem un-Roman, foreign, corrupted by Eastern influence. Cleopatra became central to this strategy. Octavian's propagandists portrayed her as a scheming seductress who had enchanted Antony with drugs and witchcraft, turning him against his own people. She was described as decadent, cruel, sexually insatiable, and dangerously ambitious. Roman poets and writers created an image of Cleopatra as the ultimate Eastern threat, a woman who sought to conquer Rome itself and make the Forum a marketplace for Egyptian gods. She represented everything Romans claimed to fear and despise about the East: luxury, autocracy, strange religions, and the inversion of proper gender roles that put a woman in power over men. Much of this propaganda focused on Antony's relationship with Cleopatra and his adoption of Eastern customs. Octavian's supporters publicized that Antony had celebrated a triumph in Alexandria rather than Rome, that he had given Roman territories to Cleopatra's children, that he lived in Oriental luxury surrounded by eunuchs and priests, that he dressed in Greek or Egyptian style rather than Roman garb. They spread rumors that he was planning to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria, that he had promised to be buried in Egypt rather than Rome, and that he intended to make Caesarion emperor after Caesar. Whether any of these claims were entirely true was less important than their emotional and political impact. They painted Antony as having ceased to be Roman, as having betrayed his heritage for an Eastern queen. The decisive moment in this propaganda war came when Octavian obtained Antony's will, or claimed to have done so. According to ancient sources, Lucius Minacius Plancus, one of Antony's former supporters who had defected to Octavian, revealed that Antony had deposited his will with the Vestal Virgins in Rome. Octavian seized the will, breaking the sacred trust that protected such documents, and read it to the Senate. The will, as Octavian reported it, confirmed many of the worst accusations against Antony. It acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's son, it granted enormous territories to Cleopatra's children, and it stated that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra rather than in Rome. Whether the will Octavian claimed to have found was genuine, forged, or selectively edited is impossible to determine from this distance in time. What matters is that it provided Octavian with the justification he needed. He used it to portray Antony as having completely abandoned his Roman identity. The Senate, manipulated by Octavian's political machine, responded by stripping Antony of his consular powers and declaring him an enemy of the state. But even this was not quite the same as declaring war on a Roman citizen. So instead, in a clever piece of political theater, Octavian had Rome declare war not on Antony but on Cleopatra, on the foreign queen who had supposedly seduced and corrupted a Roman general. This allowed Roman sentiment to be channeled against an external enemy while technically avoiding civil war between Roman citizens. The declaration of war came in 32 BCE, and both sides immediately began preparing for the confrontation. Antony and Cleopatra assembled their forces in Greece, planning to invade Italy and strike at Octavian directly. They gathered an enormous army and navy. Sources suggest Antony commanded around 100,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, while the combined fleet numbered perhaps 500 warships, including Cleopatra's 60 Egyptian vessels plus ships from various client kingdoms and cities. These forces were supported by supplies and treasure from Egypt, with Cleopatra personally present with the fleet and army, commanding her own squadron and participating in war councils. Octavian, meanwhile, mobilized the resources of the western provinces. His army was roughly comparable in size to Antony's, perhaps 80,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry, but it was commanded by Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, one of the most capable generals of the age and Octavian's closest friend and military deputy. Agrippa understood that Antony's forces, despite their impressive numbers, had weaknesses. Many of the ships were too large and unwieldy for effective maneuvering, the crews were not as experienced as Octavian's sailors, and the army, though numerous, was a mixed force of Romans, Greeks, and Eastern troops without the cohesion of Octavian's Western legions. Moreover, Agrippa recognized that Antony's supply lines, stretching back to Egypt, were vulnerable to disruption. The campaign that followed demonstrated Agrippa's strategic brilliance. Rather than meeting Antony's forces in a direct confrontation, Agrippa struck at Antony's supply lines and communications. He seized key ports along the Greek coast, cutting off Antony's access to supplies from Egypt and forcing him to rely on increasingly tenuous overland routes. By mid-31 BCE, Antony's forces were camped around the Gulf of Ambracia on the western coast of Greece, near a promontory called Actium. Octavian's forces positioned themselves to the north, blocking Antony's access to Italy while Agrippa's fleet controlled the sea approaches. Antony found himself in an increasingly untenable position. His army was large but growing short of supplies, his fleet was trapped in the Gulf, disease was beginning to spread through his camps, and allies were starting to defect to Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra faced an agonizing decision. They could attempt to break out of the trap by marching their army overland, abandoning the fleet and attempting to fight their way to safety in the east. Or they could attempt a naval breakthrough, trying to force their way past Agrippa's blockading fleet and escape to Egypt, where they could regroup and continue the war. The council of war that debated these options was reportedly fractious, with some advocating for a land campaign and others, particularly Cleopatra, arguing for a naval breakout. In the end, they decided on a plan that attempted to combine both approaches. The fleet would sortie out through the Ambracian Strait, carrying the war treasury and attempting to break through Agrippa's line. If successful, they would sail to Egypt. If unsuccessful, the army would retreat overland. On September 2, 31 BCE, the fleets engaged in what would become known as the Battle of Actium. Ancient sources provide varying accounts of the battle, but the general outline is clear. Antony's fleet sailed out through the straits in the early afternoon, arranged in 3 squadrons with Antony commanding the right, Marcus Octavius the center, and Gaius Sosius the left. Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron held position behind the main line, carrying the war treasury. Agrippa's fleet, arranged in 3 squadrons as well and positioned outside the Gulf, moved to engage. The fleets were mismatched. Antony's ships were larger, heavier, and more powerfully built, mounting towers and carrying large complements of marines for boarding actions. Agrippa's ships were smaller, faster, more maneuverable Liburnian galleys designed for ramming and hit-and-run tactics. The battle that followed was confused and desperate. Antony's heavy ships attempted to use their size and power to overwhelm Agrippa's lighter vessels, while Agrippa's ships used their superior speed and maneuverability to dart in and ram vulnerable points, and withdraw before Antony's marines could board. For hours the fleets fought inconclusively, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. Then, sometime in mid-afternoon, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly hoisted sails and made a dash for the open sea, taking advantage of a favorable wind and a gap in the enemy line. Historical debate has raged ever since about whether this was part of the original plan or whether Cleopatra panicked and fled. The ancient sources, particularly those sympathetic to Octavian, portray it as cowardly flight, with Cleopatra abandoning Antony in the midst of battle. Modern historians tend to view it as a planned maneuver, an attempt to save the treasure and allow for future resistance. Whatever the intent, Antony's response was immediate. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship and followed Cleopatra's squadron through the gap, leaving his main fleet behind. Whether he was following a prearranged plan or making a snap decision to stay with Cleopatra and the treasure rather than remain with his fleet, we cannot know. But the effect on the battle was decisive. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, the morale of the remaining fleet collapsed. Some ships continued fighting, others tried to flee, but without unified command, they were defeated piecemeal. By evening, Agrippa's forces had won a complete victory, capturing or destroying most of Antony's fleet. A week later, Antony's land army, learning of the naval defeat and the departure of their commanders, surrendered to Octavian without a fight. Antony and Cleopatra, sailing south with the remnants of their forces, had escaped the immediate disaster but found themselves in a catastrophic strategic position. They had lost most of their fleet, lost their entire army, and lost most of their allies, many of whom quickly made their peace with Octavian. They still had Egypt, still controlled considerable wealth, and might have attempted to raise new forces to continue the resistance. But the psychological and political damage was devastating. Actium had not merely been a military defeat. It had been a decisive demonstration that Octavian was the stronger party, that Antony and Cleopatra's grand vision of an Eastern Empire was finished. They spent the winter of 31 to 30 BCE in Alexandria, attempting to salvage something from the wreckage. They dissolved their society of inimitable livers and founded a new one called Partners in Death, a grimly accurate assessment of their situation. They sent diplomatic feelers to Octavian, hoping to negotiate terms, but received only cold refusals or impossible demands. Cleopatra reportedly offered to abdicate in favor of her children if Octavian would allow them to rule Egypt as client monarchs. Antony offered to retire to private life in Athens. Octavian rejected these offers, though ancient sources suggest he privately assured Cleopatra through intermediaries that if she would murder or betray Antony, she might be allowed to keep her throne. Cleopatra, to her credit, did not take this bait. As winter turned to spring and then summer, Octavian slowly advanced on Egypt. He moved deliberately, allowing time for more of Antony's former supporters to defect, letting the psychological pressure build. By late July 30th BCE, his forces had reached the outskirts of Alexandria. Antony made one last desperate attempt at resistance, leading his remaining cavalry against Octavian's forces on July 31st and actually achieving a minor tactical success. But the next day, August 1st, what remained of Antony's fleet and cavalry defected en masse to Octavian. Antony, watching from the walls of Alexandria as his men went over to the enemy without a fight, understood that everything was lost. What happened next has been preserved in various forms by ancient historians, though the details vary. Cleopatra retreated to the mausoleum she had built on her palace grounds, a two-story structure she had prepared as her tomb. She took with her two of her most trusted servants, the handmaidens Charmian and Iris. Whether she also took much of her remaining treasure, intending to destroy it rather than let Octavian capture, is unclear. Someone, perhaps one of Cleopatra's servants, perhaps someone else, sent a message to Antony that Cleopatra had committed suicide in her mausoleum. Antony, already defeated and despairing, took this as the final blow. If Cleopatra was dead, then everything he had fought for was gone. He called to one of his servants, Eros, and asked him to kill him with his sword. Eros instead drew his own sword and fell on it, dying rather than killing his master. Antony, moved by this final act of loyalty, took his own sword and stabbed himself in the abdomen. But the wound, though mortal, did not kill Antony immediately. He lay bleeding when another messenger arrived with astonishing news. Cleopatra was not dead. She was alive in her mausoleum, and she wanted to see Antony. Somehow, the ancient sources disagree on the details. Antony was carried or dragged to the mausoleum. Cleopatra, fearing to open the doors and let Octavian's soldiers in, had him hoisted through an upper window to the second floor. There, in her arms, surrounded by her handmaidens, Mark Antony died. According to Plutarch, his last words were advice to Cleopatra. She should try to make her peace with Octavian if she could do so honorably, and among Octavian's followers she should trust one Gaius Proculius more than others. Then he was gone, and Cleopatra was left alone to face the final confrontation with the man who had conquered the world. With Antony dead and Alexandria effectively under Octavian's control, Cleopatra's options had dwindled to almost nothing. She was trapped in her mausoleum, surrounded by Octavian's forces, her political power broken, her armies defeated, her allies gone. But she was still Queen of Egypt, still possessed of considerable wealth and the mystique of her ancient throne, and most importantly, she still had one card left to play: her own life. Octavian wanted to capture her alive. He paraded her through Rome in his triumphal procession as proof of his victory over the East. For Cleopatra, this fate, being exhibited to jeering Roman crowds as a trophy of conquest, was unthinkable. She would rather die than suffer such humiliation. The question was how and when. Octavian sent Gaius Proculius to the mausoleum to negotiate with Cleopatra, the same man Antony had identified as trustworthy in his dying words. Whether Antony was right to trust him or whether Proculius was simply following Octavian's orders to secure Cleopatra alive by any means necessary remains unclear. Cleopatra refused to open the sealed doors of the mausoleum, instead speaking with Proculius through a small opening. According to the ancient sources, she repeated her earlier offers. She would yield her kingdom if Octavian would allow her children to inherit the throne. She may have hoped by time to preserve something for her children, or simply to appear cooperative while planning her own death. But Octavian had no intention of allowing Cleopatra's children to rule Egypt. While Cleopatra was speaking with Proculius, other soldiers were entering the mausoleum through an upper window, the same window through which Antony had been hoisted to his death. They seized Cleopatra before she could harm herself. She tried to stab herself with a dagger she had hidden in her clothing, but the soldiers wrested it from her. She was now Octavian's prisoner, held under guard in her own mausoleum or possibly moved to the palace, with her every action monitored to prevent suicide. Octavian visited her personally, though ancient accounts differ on the details of their meeting. He was reportedly courteous but firm, making it clear that he held all the power. Some sources suggest he promised her kind treatment, though he carefully avoided any commitment about her future. Cleopatra, who had charmed both Caesar and Antony, apparently attempted to work her magic on Octavian as well. But Octavian was younger, colder, more calculating than either of his predecessors. He was, if the ancient sources are to be believed, genuinely immune to Cleopatra's charms, seeing her as simply a political problem to be managed. Some historians have questioned whether Cleopatra's attempt to seduce Octavian was genuine or whether she was simply playing a role, buying time until she could arrange her death with dignity rather than in chains. The ancient historian Plutarch preserves a story that one of Cleopatra's servants overheard a guard mentioning that Octavian planned to leave Alexandria within 3 days and would take Cleopatra and her children with him to Rome. This information, if accurate, would have confirmed Cleopatra's worst fears. She was to be paraded in Octavian's triumph, displayed to the Roman mob as a captive enemy. The date was August 10, 30 BCE, or possibly August 12. Ancient sources differ by a day or two. Cleopatra knew she had very little time to act. She asked her guards for permission to visit Antony's tomb to pour libations and make offerings, a request that was granted, as it seemed harmless and pious. There, according to Plutarch, she spoke to Antony's shade, lamenting their fate and begging that she not be forced to participate in Octavian's triumph. When she returned to the mausoleum or palace, she bathed, dressed in her finest royal regalia, and ordered a lavish meal. During or after this meal, a countryman arrived carrying a basket of figs. The guards inspected the basket but saw only figs and allowed it through. Cleopatra dismissed all but her 2 most trusted handmaidens, Charmian and Iris, and sealed herself in her chamber. Shortly afterward, a messenger delivered a sealed letter to Octavian from Cleopatra. When Octavian opened it, he found a request that she be buried beside Antony. Octavian immediately understood what this meant. He sent guards rushing to Cleopatra's chamber, but they were too late. When they burst through the doors, they found Cleopatra dead on a golden couch, dressed in her royal robes and wearing her crown. Iris lay dead at her feet, and Charmian, barely alive, was adjusting Cleopatra's crown before she too collapsed and died. According to one account, when a guard angrily asked Charmian if this was well done, she replied with her dying breath, "It is well done, and fitting for a princess descended of so many royal kings." The exact method of Cleopatra's death has been debated for more than 2,000 years. The most famous version, popularized by Plutarch in countless artistic depictions since, claims that an asp, an Egyptian cobra, had been smuggled into Cleopatra's chamber in the basket of figs, and that she allowed it to bite her arm or breast, dying from the venom. This story has tremendous symbolic power. The cobra was a royal symbol in Egypt, associated with the uraeus worn on the pharaoh's crown, and death by cobra bite would have been seen as a royal and dignified end. But modern scholars have raised serious doubts about this account. Egyptian cobras are large snakes, typically 5 to 6 feet long, too large to hide easily in a basket of figs. Their bites are not always fatal and usually cause a slow, painful death rather than the quick and peaceful end described in the ancient sources. And it would have been extremely difficult for a snake to kill 3 adult women in quick succession as the ancient accounts suggest. Alternative explanations offered by ancient sources include poison concealed in a hollow hairpin, a poisoned ointment, or a toxic drink. Plutarch himself notes uncertainty, stating that there were 2 faint marks found on Cleopatra's arm but acknowledging that no one knew for certain how she died. Some modern scholars have suggested she may have used a combination of poisons, perhaps opium for sedation followed by a more lethal toxin, to ensure a peaceful death. Ancient texts suggest that Cleopatra had long been interested in poisons and had even tested various toxins on condemned prisoners to determine which produced the least painful death, implying she had planned for this possibility well in advance. What seems most likely is that Cleopatra did indeed die by poison, carefully chosen to provide a relatively quick and painless death, and that the story of the asp was either a Roman embellishment or a symbolic interpretation that captured something essential about her death without being literally accurate. The asp represented royal authority and divine power in Egyptian symbolism, and Cleopatra's death, however achieved, was presented as a final assertion of her royal dignity in the face of certain humiliation. She had chosen death on her own terms rather than life as Octavian's captive. It was a final act of defiance and a final demonstration that even in defeat she remained a queen. Octavian was reportedly furious at being cheated of his prize. He had wanted to parade Cleopatra in his triumph, to exhibit the exotic Eastern queen to the Roman crowds as proof of his total victory. Ancient sources even claim that he brought in snake charmers from Libya to try to suck the poison from her wounds and revive her, though if he did, their efforts failed. But he had Cleopatra's body, and he honored her request to be buried alongside Antony. He also honored her memory in a way, by including an effigy of Cleopatra in his triumph when he celebrated it in Rome in 29 BCE. This effigy showed her with an asp clinging to her, establishing the image that would dominate Western imagination for millennia to come. Cleopatra's death on August 10 or 12, 30 BCE, marked the end of far more than one woman's life. Caesaron, Cleopatra's eldest son and the boy she had proclaimed as Julius Caesar's heir and the future king of Egypt, survived his mother by only a few weeks. Cleopatra had sent him south to the Red Sea, possibly with plans to flee to India or Ethiopia, but he was persuaded to return by false promises of safety. Octavian had him arrested and executed, reportedly influenced by his advisor Arrius Didymus, who allegedly said that 2 Caesars are 1 too many. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared, taken to Rome, and raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman widow. Cleopatra Selene would eventually be married to Juba II, the king of Mauritania, and would rule there until her death. The fate of her brothers is unknown. They disappear from the historical record and presumably died young. With Caesarion's execution, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for 275 years, came to an end. On August 31, 30 BCE, Octavian formally annexed Egypt as a Roman province. But Egypt was not to be an ordinary province. It was too wealthy, too strategically important, too dangerous to be entrusted to a senator who might use its resources to threaten Octavian's own power. Instead, Octavian made Egypt his personal possession, governed by a prefect appointed directly by him and accountable to no one else. Senators were forbidden even to visit Egypt without the emperor's express permission. Egypt's grain, wealth, and resources would support Octavian's regime directly, making him the wealthiest and most powerful man in the Mediterranean world. The death of Cleopatra and the annexation of Egypt marked the end of the Hellenistic Age, the 300-year period that had begun with Alexander the Great's conquests in the late 4th century BCE. The Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemaic, Seleucid, and Antigonid dynasties that had ruled the eastern Mediterranean, were all gone, absorbed into the Roman Empire. The culture and learning of the Hellenistic world would continue to flourish under Roman rule, but the political independence of the Greek-speaking East was finished. Rome now dominated the entire Mediterranean, from Spain to Syria, from Britain to Egypt, and the republican system that had conquered this empire was giving way to the imperial monarchy that Octavian would establish when he became Augustus, the first Roman emperor, in 27 BCE. But perhaps most significantly, Cleopatra's death marked the end of pharaonic Egypt, a civilization that had existed for more than 3,000 years. The first pharaohs had ruled Egypt around 3100 BCE, creating one of the oldest and most enduring civilizations in human history. Through all the millennia since, through countless dynasties, foreign invasions, and periods of chaos, the institution of the pharaoh had endured. Even the Ptolemies, foreign Greeks though they were, had maintained the pharaonic tradition, presenting themselves as the successors to the ancient kings, participating in the ancient ceremonies, building in the ancient styles. Cleopatra was the last to do this. After her death, Egypt would have Roman prefects and later Byzantine and Islamic rulers, but it would never again have a pharaoh. An age that had begun when the pyramids were built, when hieroglyphics were first carved into stone, when the Nile cycles first governed human civilization, had finally ended. More than 2,000 years after her death, Cleopatra remains one of the most famous women in history, yet also one of the most misunderstood. Her image has been shaped and reshaped by successive generations, each projecting onto her their own anxieties and fantasies about power, sexuality, gender, and the relationship between East and West. The Cleopatra of popular imagination, the seductress who used her beauty to manipulate powerful men, the decadent Eastern queen who represented luxury and moral corruption, the tragic romantic who died for love, bears only a passing resemblance to the historical Cleopatra, the intelligent and capable monarch who ruled Egypt for 21 years through extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The distortion of Cleopatra's image began even before her death, with the propaganda campaign waged by Octavian. For Octavian, it was essential to portray Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign enemy, a seductress who had corrupted good Roman men and threatened Rome itself. This narrative served multiple purposes. It justified Rome's war against Egypt by making it seem like self-defense against an existential threat. It explained Antony's rebellion by attributing it to enchantment rather than his own choices, making him a victim rather than a traitor. And it portrayed Octavian's victory not merely as a triumph in civil war but as the salvation of Rome from a terrible danger. The Roman sources that describe Cleopatra, the histories of Cassius Dio, Plutarch's biographies, the poetry of Horace and Virgil, all come from this tradition. They were written by Romans or Greeks working within Roman cultural frameworks, often decades or even centuries after the events they describe, and they generally accept the basic outlines of Octavian's propaganda. They portray Cleopatra as ambitious, manipulative, and dangerously seductive. They emphasize her romantic relationships with Caesar and Antony while downplaying or ignoring her political accomplishments. They attribute supernatural or magical powers to her influence over men, suggesting she used drugs, potions, or spells rather than simply intelligent conversation and political acumen. They often present her in explicitly sexualized terms, emphasizing her beauty and feminine wiles rather than her intellect and administrative abilities. Yet even these hostile sources cannot entirely suppress evidence of Cleopatra's actual character and achievements. Plutarch, despite his generally negative portrayal, admits that Cleopatra's beauty was not exceptional but that her conversation was irresistible, her intellect impressive, her linguistic abilities extraordinary. Cassius Dio acknowledges her political skills and the genuine love that Antony seems to have felt for her. The archaeological and documentary evidence that has survived, inscriptions, coins, papyri, temple reliefs, shows Cleopatra as an active and involved ruler, participating in religious ceremonies, issuing administrative decrees, managing the economy, and maintaining the complex apparatus of the Egyptian state. Modern scholarship has worked to separate the historical Cleopatra from the legendary one, using archaeological evidence, careful analysis of ancient texts, and contextualization within what we know about Ptolemaic Egypt and Roman politics. This scholarship has revealed a far more complex and impressive figure than the seductress of legend. The historical Cleopatra was, first and foremost, a survivor. She came to power at 18 in a kingdom facing bankruptcy, famine, civil war, and Roman domination. Most rulers in such a position would have been swept away quickly, but Cleopatra not only survived but maintained and even expanded her power for more than 2 decades. Her intelligence was her greatest weapon. The multilingual skills that allowed her to communicate directly with subjects, allies, and rivals in their own languages gave her enormous diplomatic advantage. Her understanding of both Greek and Egyptian culture allowed her to position herself as a bridge between these worlds, winning loyalty from both the Greek elite and the native Egyptian population. Her grasp of economics and administration kept Egypt functioning despite enormous pressures. Her political acumen allowed her to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics, forming alliances with the right people at the right times and maintaining Egypt's independence far longer than seemed possible. The question of Cleopatra's beauty, which has obsessed artists and writers for centuries, is actually one of the least important aspects of her historical significance. The ancient sources disagree about whether she was beautiful in conventional terms. Plutarch explicitly states that her appearance was not remarkably beautiful, but that her charm and charisma were irresistible. Coins bearing her portrait show a woman with strong, somewhat masculine features, a prominent nose, firm jaw, and serious expression, which may be realistic portraits or may be stylized images meant to project authority rather than conventional beauty. What is clear is that both Caesar and Antony, 2 of the most powerful and experienced men of their age, found Cleopatra compelling enough to form long-term partnerships with her, and this was almost certainly due more to her intelligence, conversational brilliance, and political skills than to physical appearance alone. The legend of Cleopatra as seductress who corrupted strong men reflects ancient and modern anxieties about female power more than it reflects historical reality. In the patriarchal societies of both ancient Rome and subsequent Western civilization, the idea of a woman wielding genuine political power was deeply threatening. One way to neutralize this threat was to attribute her power to sexuality rather than intelligence, to suggest that she achieved influence through her body rather than her mind. By making Cleopatra's story primarily about romance and seduction, subsequent traditions could avoid confronting the uncomfortable reality of a woman who commanded armies, governed nations, and nearly succeeded in challenging Roman domination of the Mediterranean world through political and military skill. The real story of Cleopatra and her relationships with Caesar and Antony is more complex and more interesting than the romantic legend. These were not simply love affairs but political alliances carefully calculated by all parties involved. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns and its political stability to secure his eastern frontier. Cleopatra needed Roman military support to maintain her throne. They could help each other, and both were intelligent enough to recognize this. The fact that they also apparently developed genuine affection and respect for each other does not negate the political dimension of their partnership. Rather, it shows that political alliance and personal connection can coexist and reinforce each other. Similarly, Cleopatra and Antony's relationship was both romantic and political. They seemed to have genuinely enjoyed each other's company, to have shared interests in Dionysian pleasures and grandiose visions of empire. But their partnership was fundamentally based on mutual need. Antony needed Egypt's resources, Cleopatra needed Roman protection and the possibility of expanded territory. The 14-year alliance between them was remarkably successful for most of its duration, achieving significant political and military objectives and coming remarkably close to creating a new political order in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its ultimate failure was due not to Cleopatra's supposed seductive corruption of Antony but to Octavian's superior political skills, better military leadership under Agrippa, and the structural advantages of controlling the western provinces, particularly Italy. Modern archaeology and reassessment of ancient texts has revealed other aspects of Cleopatra's rule that the ancient sources largely ignore. Her extensive temple-building program demonstrated both religious devotion and political savvy, employing thousands of workers and winning support from Egypt's powerful priesthoods. Her economic policies, while not always successful, showed sophisticated understanding of state finance and revenue management. Her naval power, often overlooked in accounts focused on land battles and political intrigue, was substantial and played crucial roles in multiple conflicts. Her administrative appointments and diplomatic relationships showed careful attention to building and maintaining networks of loyal supporters. In short, the archaeological and documentary record shows a ruler actively engaged in a complex business of governing a major kingdom, not a frivolous seductress playing at politics. Perhaps the most important revision of Cleopatra's image involves recognizing her as an Egyptian patriot fighting to preserve her kingdom's independence. The narrative established by Roman propaganda and perpetuated through subsequent Western tradition portrays Cleopatra as anti-Roman, a foreign enemy who sought Rome's destruction. But this fundamentally misunderstands her position and motivations. Cleopatra was not anti-Roman, she was pro-Egyptian. She understood better than perhaps any other ruler of her time that Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean and that Egypt's survival depended on maintaining good relations with Rome. Her partnerships with Caesar and Antony were attempts to secure Roman protection while preserving Egyptian independence. Her vision of an Eastern empire centered on Alexandria was not a rejection of Rome but an alternative model of how the Mediterranean world might be organized, one that would preserve Hellenistic culture and political forms while acknowledging Roman military supremacy. This vision failed, but it was not a foolish or impossible dream. Had Antony defeated Octavian at Actium, or had the battle simply been indecisive rather than a clear Octavian victory, the subsequent history of the Mediterranean might have been very different. An Eastern empire centered on Alexandria, with Cleopatra and her descendants as monarchs and Antony and his successors as the military arm of Roman power in the East, might have created a more balanced and less centralized imperial system. Egyptian independence might have been preserved in some form. The Hellenistic cultural tradition might have maintained greater autonomy from Rome. These were real possibilities, not mere fantasies, and Cleopatra came closer to achieving them than anyone else could have in her position. In the end, Cleopatra's greatest achievement may have been simply holding off the inevitable for as long as she did. Egypt was doomed to be absorbed into Rome's empire. This was probably unavoidable given the balance of power in the 1st century BCE. But Cleopatra delayed that absorption for more than 2 decades, maintained Egyptian independence through her own political skill and the careful management of relationships with Roman power brokers, and even came close to transforming defeat into a new kind of victory through her partnership with Antony. She was the last pharaoh, the last independent ruler of ancient Egypt, and she filled that role with intelligence, courage, and a vision of what might have been. The tragedy of Cleopatra is not the romantic tragedy of a woman who died for love, as countless plays, operas, and films have portrayed it. The real tragedy is the tragedy of a capable ruler who fought to preserve her kingdom's independence in an age when kingdoms were becoming obsolete, who understood power and wielded it skillfully but faced forces too large to overcome, and who died knowing that everything she had fought for, Egyptian independence, the Ptolemaic dynasty, the vision of an Eastern empire, died with her. It is the tragedy of a civilization 3,000 years old coming to an end, and of the last monarch who tried desperately to prevent that ending. And so we come to the end of Cleopatra's story, though her legend, as we have seen, has proven far more enduring than her kingdom. She played what may have been the most dangerous game in the ancient world, the game of Mediterranean politics in an age when kingdoms and republics were collapsing into empire, when the old orders were dying and a new world was being born in violence and upheaval. She played this game with skill and intelligence that her enemies had to grudgingly acknowledge even as they vilified her. She understood that her kingdom's survival depended on alliance with Rome, on carefully managing relationships with the men who held Roman power, on providing them with what they needed while extracting from them protection and support for Egypt. She understood this strategy and executed it brilliantly for more than 20 years, longer than seemed possible given Egypt's weakness and Rome's overwhelming strength. But Cleopatra refused to become merely a client queen, a puppet ruler who would do Rome's bidding without question. She insisted on being a partner, an ally rather than a subject. She demanded to be treated as the equal of the Roman generals she dealt with, and remarkably, both Caesar and Antony seem to have accepted this claim, at least to some degree. She maintained Egyptian independence, preserved pharaonic traditions, expanded her kingdom's territory, and came closer than anyone else in her position could have to creating a new political order that might have preserved some measure of Eastern autonomy in a Roman-dominated world. That she ultimately failed should not blind us to how much she accomplished. She was 18 when she took the throne of a kingdom in crisis. She was driven into exile, fought a civil war, was besieged in Alexandria, watched as Roman armies battled in her capital streets. She formed an alliance with Caesar that restored her to power and gave her a son who might someday unite East and West. She survived Caesar's assassination and the chaos that followed. She formed a partnership with Antony that lasted 14 years and achieved remarkable successes. She ruled Egypt through famine and war and financial crisis, maintaining the complex apparatus of one of the ancient world's most sophisticated states. She raised 4 children, promoted Caesarion as Caesar's heir and future king, gave her other children kingdoms and titles that proclaimed a vision of Ptolemaic empire renewed. She commanded fleets, participated in military campaigns, negotiated with kings and generals, managed an economy, performed religious ceremonies, spoke 9 languages, and never stopped fighting for her vision of Egypt's future. The fact that Octavian defeated her in the end says more about the structural advantages of controlling Rome's western provinces and Octavian's own considerable political and military skills than it does about any failure on Cleopatra's part. She fought as well as anyone could have fought, with the resources available to her, against an opponent who proved to be perhaps the most formidable politician of the ancient world. Her final choice, to die by her own hand rather than be paraded in Octavian's triumph, was her last assertion of royal dignity, her final refusal to submit to Roman humiliation. Her legacy, when we strip away the propaganda and the romantic embellishments, reminds us that history is indeed written by victors, and that we must always question the narratives we inherit. The Cleopatra of Roman sources and Western tradition, the seductress, the decadent Eastern queen, the tragic romantic, was a creation designed to justify Roman conquest and male dominance, to make comfortable a story that was actually quite disturbing. The story of how Rome destroyed the last great independent kingdom of the Eastern Mediterranean and how one woman nearly prevented them from doing so. Behind that propaganda stood a woman whose intelligence, determination, and political vision deserved to be remembered on their own terms, not through the distorting lens of her enemies' characterizations. Cleopatra VII Philopator, the father-loving goddess, last active pharaoh of Egypt, queen of kings, the new Isis, mother of Caesarion and partner of Antony, was far more than a seductress. She was a monarch who fought to preserve her kingdom's independence in an age when kingdoms had become obsolete. She was a politician who understood power and wielded it with skill. She was a scholar who mastered languages and sciences. She was a mother who raised her children to claim thrones. She was a woman who insisted on being treated as an equal by the most powerful men of her age, and who nearly succeeded in creating a world where such equality might have been possible. That she failed, that Egypt fell to Rome, that the Ptolemaic dynasty ended with her death, that 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization came to a close. These are the facts of history. But they should not obscure the remarkable achievement of the woman who stood against that tide for more than 2 decades, who fought with every resource at her command to prevent the inevitable, and who died on her own terms, a queen to the very end. If you've enjoyed this deep exploration of Cleopatra's life, her reign, and her enduring legacy, please consider liking this video and subscribing to The Drowsy Archivist for more comprehensive historical narratives. Share your thoughts on Cleopatra in the comments below. Was she the seductress of legend, or the capable politician and monarch that modern scholarship reveals? And if there are other historical figures or events you'd like us to explore in future episodes, let us know. Until next time, may your own journeys through history be as rich and rewarding as Cleopatra's story has proven to be.